Where Good Ideas Come From, by Stephen Johnson. Audiobooks from 27audiobooks.com. Part 2. This part includes 3 chapters. Chapter 5, Error. Chapter 6, Exaptation. Chapter 7, Platforms. Chapter 5, Error. In the summer of 1900, a 27-year-old aspiring inventor named Lee DeForest moved to Chicago, rented a one-room apartment on Washington Boulevard, and took a day job translating foreign articles on wireless technology for Western Electrician magazine. The translation work was informative. A major exposition on wireless technology that had just been held in Paris guaranteed a constant flow of interesting new research papers across the Atlantic. But DeForest's true passion lay in the cabinet of wonders he had assembled in his bedroom on Washington Boulevard: batteries, spark gap transmitters, electrodes. All the building blocks that would be assembled in the coming decade to invent the age of electronics. For a budding innovator in wireless telegraphy at the turn of the century, the spark gap transmitter was the most essential of gadgets. Hertz and Marconi's original explorations of the electromagnetic spectrum had relied on spark gaps. The device employed 2 electrodes separated by a small gap. A battery attached to the electrodes supplied a surge of electricity, which caused a spark to jump from one electrode to the other, triggering a pulse of electromagnetic activity that could be detected and amplified by antennae miles away. Spark gap machines emitted a terse blast of monotone noise, perfect for sending Morse code. On the night of September 10, 1900, DeForest was experimenting with his spark gap machine in the corner of his Washington Boulevard bedroom. Across the room, the red flame of a Wellspark burner flickered 15 feet away. DeForest triggered a surge of voltage through the spark gap, and as the machine crackled, he could see the flame of the burner instantly change from red to white heat. DeForest later estimated that the flame's intensity had increased by several candle power. Somehow, for reasons that DeForest could not explain, the electromagnetic pulse of the spark gap was intensifying the energy of a flame 15 feet away. Watching that flame shift from red to white planted the seed of an idea in DeForest's head, that a gas could be employed as a wireless detector, one that might be more sensitive than anything Marconi or Tesla had created to date. DeForest had stumbled across a classic slow hunch. In his autobiography, DeForest described the gas flame detector as a subject that had ever since been in the back of my mind. In the end, that hunch would mature into an invention that ultimately changed the landscape of the 20th century. An invention that made radio, television, and the first digital computers possible. In 1903, he began a series of failed experiments with placing 2 electrodes in gas-filled glass bulbs. He continued tinkering with the model until, several years later, he hit upon the idea of placing a 3rd electrode in the bulb, attached to an antenna or external tuner. After a number of iterations, he used a piece of wire that had been bent back and forth several times as the middle electrode. DeForest called it the grid. Early tests showed that the device, which DeForest dubbed the Audione, proved far superior to other technology at amplifying audio signals without degrading the tuner's ability to separate out signals at different frequencies. DeForest's creation would eventually be called a triode. Its 3-electrode architecture would form the basis of the vacuum tubes that began to be mass-produced in the following decade. Radio receivers, telephone switchboards, television sets, all the communications revolutions of the first half of the century relied on some variation of DeForest's design to boost their signals. Initially employed for amplification, the vacuum tube turned out to have an unforeseen use as an electronic switch, enabling the high-speed logic gates of the first digital computers in the 1940s. When DeForest twisted the wire into the shape of a grid and placed it between those 2 electrodes, he was unwittingly opening up the adjacent possible for the analytical engine that Charles Babbage had failed to produce 60 years before. The power of that new portal was apparent instantly. The first computer built with vacuum tubes, the mammoth ENIAC, ran calculations that helped develop the hydrogen bomb. The invention of the Audione sounds like a classic story of ingenuity and persistence. A maverick inventor holed up in his bedroom lab notices a striking pattern and tinkers with it for years as a slow hunch, until he hits upon a contraption that changes the world. But telling the story that way misses one crucial fact, that at almost every step of the way, DeForest was flat out wrong about what he was inventing. The Audione was not so much an invention as it was the steady, persistent accumulation of error. The strange communication between the spark gap transmitter and the Wellspark gas burner flame turned out to have nothing to do with the electromagnetic spectrum. But because DeForest had begun with this erroneous notion that the gas flame was detecting the radio signals, All his iterations of the audion involved some low-pressure gas inside the device, which severely limited their reliability. It took another decade for researchers at General Electric and other firms to realize that the triode performed far more effectively in a true vacuum. Even DeForest himself willingly admitted that he didn't understand the device he had invented. "I didn't know why it worked," he remarked. "It just did." DeForest may have been the most erratic of the 20th century's great inventors, but the error-prone history of his greatest success is hardly anomalous. The history of being spectacularly right has a shadow history lurking behind it, a much longer history of being spectacularly wrong again and again. And not just wrong, but messy. A shockingly large number of transformative ideas in the annals of science can be attributed to contaminated laboratory environments. Alexander Fleming famously discovered the medical virtues of penicillin when the mold accidentally infiltrated a culture of staphylococcus he had left by an open window in his lab. In the 1830s, Louis Daguerre spent years trying to coax images out of iodized silver plates. One night, after another futile attempt, he stored the plates in a cabinet packed with chemicals. To his wonder, the next morning, the fumes from a spilled jar of mercury produced a perfect image on the plate, and the Daguerreotype, forerunner of modern photography, was born. In the summer of 1951, a World War II Navy veteran named Wilson Greatbatch was working at an animal behavior farm affiliated with the psychology department at Cornell, where he was studying under the G.I. Bill. Greatbatch had long been a ham radio enthusiast. As a teenager, he had built his own shortwave radio by cobbling together the descendants of DeForest's audion. His love of gadgets had drawn him to the Cornell farm because the psychology department needed someone to attach experimental instruments to the animals, measuring their brain waves, heartbeats, and blood pressure. One day, Greatbatch happened to sit at lunch with two visiting surgeons and got into a conversation about the dangers of irregular heartbeats. Something in their description of the ailment triggered an association in Greatbatch's mind. He imagined the heart as a radio that was failing to transmit or receive a signal properly. He knew the history of modern electronics had been all about regulating the electrical signals passed between devices with ever more miraculous precision. Could you take all that knowledge and apply it to the human heart? Greatbatch stored the idea in the back of his head for the next 5 years, where it lingered as a slow hunch. He moved to Buffalo, started teaching electrical engineering, and moonlighted at the Chronic Disease Institute. A physician at the institute recruited Greatbatch to help him engineer an oscillator that would record heartbeats using the new silicon transistors that were threatening to replace the vacuum tube. One day, while working on the device, Greatbatch happened to grab the wrong resistor. When he plugged it into the oscillator, it began to pulse in a familiar rhythm. Thanks to Greatbatch's error, the device was simulating the beat of a human heart, not recording it. His mind flashed back to his conversation on the farm 5 years before. Here, at last, was the beginning of a device that could restore the faulty signal of an irregular heart by shocking it back into sync at precise interval. Within 2 years, Greatbatch and a Buffalo surgeon named William Chardak deployed the first implantable cardiac pacemaker on the heart of a dog. By 1960, the Greatbatch Chardak pacemaker was pulsing steadily in the chests of 10 human beings. Variations of Greatbatch's original design have now saved or prolonged millions of lives around the world. Greatbatch's pacemaker is an instance where a great idea came, literally, from a novel combination of spare parts. Sometimes those novel combinations arrive courtesy of the random collisions of city streets or the dreaming brain. But sometimes they come from simple mistakes. You reach into the bag of resistors and pull out the wrong one, and 4 years later, you're saving someone's life. Yet error on its own is rarely enough. Greatbatch had his epiphany while hearing the reliable pulse of his oscillator because he'd been thinking about the irregular heartbeats as a signal transmission problem for 5 years. This, too, is a recurring pattern in the history of being wrong. The inventions of radiography, vulcanized rubber, and plastic all depended on generative mistakes that were generative precisely because they connected to slow hunches in the minds of their creators. The British economist William Stanley Jevons, who had first-hand experience as an inventor himself, described the prominence of error in his Principles of Science, first published in 1874. It would be an error to suppose that the great discoverer seizes at once upon the truth or has any unerring method of divining it. In all probability, the errors of the great mind exceed in number those of the less vigorous one. Fertility of imagination and abundance of guesses at truth are among the first requisites of discovery. But the erroneous guesses must be many times as numerous as those that prove well-founded. The weakest analogies, the most whimsical notions, the most apparently absurd theories may pass through the teeming brain and no record remain of more than the 100th part. The errors of the great mind exceed in number those of the less vigorous one. Not merely statistics. It is not that the pioneering thinkers are simply more productive than less vigorous ones, generating more ideas overall, both good and bad. Some historical studies of patent records have in fact shown that overall productivity correlates with radical breakthroughs in science and technology, that sheer quantity ultimately leads to quality. But Jevons is making a more subtle case for the role of error in innovation, because error is not simply a phase you have to suffer through on the way to genius. Error often creates a path that leads you out of your comfortable assumptions. De Forest was wrong about the utility of gas as a detector, but he kept probing at the edges of that error until he hit upon something that was genuinely useful. Being right keeps you in place. Being wrong forces you to explore. Thomas Kuhn makes a comparable argument for the role of error in the structure of scientific revolution. Paradigm shifts, in Kuhn's argument, begin with anomalies in the data when scientists find that their predictions keep turning out to be wrong. When Joseph Priestley first placed a mint plant in a bell jar to deprive it of oxygen, he expected that the plant would die, just as mice or spiders perished in the same circumstances. But he was wrong, the plant thrived. In fact, it thrived even if you burned all the oxygen out of the jar before placing the plant in it. Priestley's error energized him to investigate this strange behavior, and it ultimately led him to one of the founding discoveries of what we now call ecosystem science. The realization that plants expel oxygen as part of photosynthesis, and indeed have created much of the Earth's atmosphere. As William James put it, the error is needed to set off the truth, much as a dark background is required for exhibiting the brightness of a picture. When we're wrong, we have to challenge our assumptions, adopt new strategies. Being wrong on its own doesn't unlock new doors in the adjacent possible, but it does force us to look for them. The trouble with error is that we have a natural tendency to dismiss it. When Kevin Dunbar analyzed the data from his in vivo studies of microbiology labs, one of his most remarkable findings was just how many experiments produced results that were genuinely unexpected. More than half of the data collected by the researchers deviated significantly from what they had predicted they would find. Dunbar found that the scientists tended to treat these surprising outcomes as the result of flaws in their experimental method, some kind of contamination of the original tissue perhaps, or a mechanical malfunction, or an error at the data processing phase. They assumed the result was noise, not signal. Transforming error into insight turned out to be one of the key functions of the lab conference. In Dunbar's research, outsiders working on different problems were much less likely to dismiss the apparent error as useless noise. Coming at the problem from a different perspective, with few preconceived ideas about what the correct result was supposed to be, allowed them to conceptualize scenarios where the mistake might actually be meaningful. As the science writer Jonah Lehrer has observed, this pattern appears in one of the great scientific breakthroughs of 20th century physics, the discovery of cosmic background radiation, which was mistaken for meaningless static by the astronomers Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson for more than a year, until a chance conversation with a Princeton nuclear physicist planted the idea that the noise was not the result of faulty equipment, but rather the still lingering reverberation of the Big Bang. Two brilliant scientists with great technological acumen stumble across evidence of the universe's origin, evidence that would ultimately lead to a Nobel Prize for both them, and yet their first reaction is, our telescope must be broken. About 30 years ago, a Berkeley psychology professor named Charles Nemeth began investigating the relationship between noise, dissent, and creativity in group environments. One of Nemeth's early experiments assembled small groups of test subjects and showed them a series of slides, each of which was dominated by a single color. The subjects were asked to evaluate the color and the brightness of each slide. After they had analyzed the slides, Nemeth asked them to free associate on the color they had perceived in the slides. There are few actions as commonly connected to the pursuit of creativity as free associating. Trying to come up with a new slogan for a detergent, struggling for a new perspective on your memories of childhood trauma, compiling thoughts for a sonnet, free associating, we are told, will help us find our answer. But psychologists have long been in on the joke that humans free associate in absurdly predictable ways. Take 100 Americans off the street and ask them to free associate on the word green, and 40 of them will say grass. Another 40 will offer up another color, red or yellow or blue, or the word color itself. The more creative associations only emerge when you get to the bottom 20% of responses, the long tail of free association, where words like Ireland, or money, or leaves appear. Ask them to free associate on the word blue and you'll see the same pattern. 80% will suggest either another color or the word sky, and the last 20% of associations will be scattered across dozens of less predictable responses: genes, lake, or lonely. Psychologists have assembled immense probability tables that document the patterns of free association for hundreds of words. These norms of association give them a stable yardstick for measuring creative thinking in different environments. Some situations cause people to get even more predictable with their associations, offering up grass and blue like obedient robots. But other situations can push their associations down the tail of the distribution, into the more eclectic zone of Ireland and money. Individuals who are unusually creative tend to generate more original associations when tested. Charles Nemeth's experiment was a perfect embodiment of this predictability. Blue slides triggered utterly conventional word associations, sky and green and color dominated, while the more innovative associations were restricted to the bottom 20%. But then Nemeth ran another version of the experiment, this time with a twist. She showed the same slides to small groups of subjects, only, in this version, she secretly seated each group with a handful of actors who were instructed to describe each slide inaccurately, as if it were a different color. The real test subjects correctly described the blue slides as blue and were surprised to find that their peers somehow saw the very same color and perceived it as green. When Nemeth took this cohort and asked them to free associate on the color names they had mentioned, the words they came up with were markedly different from the earlier groups. Some of them dutifully suggested sky, like normal respondents, but the sort of associations that usually resided in the creative tail of the distribution, jazz or jeans, were far more numerous. In other words, when subjects were exposed to inaccurate descriptions of the slides, they became more creative. Associations that traditionally lay on the fringes of the probability table suddenly became mainstream. Nemeth had deliberately introduced noise into the decision-making process, and what she found ran directly counter to our intuitive assumptions about truth and error. The groups that had been deliberately contaminated with erroneous information ended up making more original connections than the groups that had only been given pure information. The dissenting actors prodded the other subjects into exploring new rooms in the adjacent possible, even though they were, technically speaking, adding incorrect data to the environment. Nemeth has gone on to document the same phenomenon at work in dozens of different environments: mock juries, boardrooms, academic seminars. Her research suggests a paradoxical truth about innovation. Good ideas are more likely to emerge in environments that contain a certain amount of noise and error. You would think that innovation would be more strongly correlated with the values of accuracy, clarity, and focus. A good idea has to be correct on some basic level, and we value good ideas because they tend to have a high signal-to-noise ratio. But that doesn't mean you want to cultivate those ideas in noise-free environments, because noise-free environments end up being too sterile and predictable in their output. The best innovation labs are always a little contaminated. The next time you visit a zoo or a natural history museum and survey the extraordinary diversity of the organisms on our planet, pause for a second to remind yourself that all this variation, the elephant tusks and peacock tails and human neocortices, was made possible, in part, by error. Without noise, evolution would stagnate, an endless series of perfect copies, incapable of change. But because DNA is susceptible to error, whether mutations in the code itself or transcription mistakes during replication, natural selection has a constant source of new possibilities to test. Most of the time, these errors lead to disastrous outcomes, or have no effect whatsoever. But every now and then, a mutation opens up a new wing of the adjacent possible. From an evolutionary perspective, it's not enough to say to err is human. Error is what made humans possible in the first place. The prominence of random mutation in our evolutionary history has long been associated with Darwin's original theory. But the truth is that Darwin himself had a hard time accepting the premise that undirected random variation could produce the marvelous innovations of life. When Darwin first outlined the theory of natural selection as the preservation of favorable variations and rejection of injurious variations and on the origin of species, he lacked a convincing theory about where all those variations came from. In Origin, he generally writes about them as though they are random, in part because he is explicitly trying to shed the Lamarckian notion of directed variation, where new innovations, the giraffe's long neck being the canonical example, are generated by activity during the organism's lifetime and then passed down to the next generation. But during the decade that followed, Darwin retreated from the cliff of random variation and developed a theory called pangenesis, first published in his 1868 book, The Variation of Animals and Plants Under Domestication. Pangenesis dialed back the noise of Darwin's original theory, introducing a complex mechanism for heredity that created a kind of directed variation. In Darwin's theory, each cell in the body released hereditary particles called gemmules that collected in the germ cells of the organism. A particular organ or limb that was heavily used during the lifetime of the animal would release more gemmules, and thus shape the physiology of the next generation. Pangenesis was well received at the time Darwin proposed it, but the modern science of genetics would ultimately reveal it to be entirely false. It would prove to be the most egregious mistake of his scientific career. In a sense, Darwin's greatest error was his failure to understand the protean force of error. Too much error is deadly, of course, which is why your cells contain elaborate mechanisms for repairing damaged DNA and for ensuring that the transcoding process is accurate down to the last nucleotide. An organism that constantly rescrambled the genetic code passed down to its descendants would be more innovative in its offspring, but only in the sense that those offspring would find many novel ways to perish before or shortly after birth. No parents want genetic mutations in their child. But as a species, we have been dependent on mutation. That dependence is why some scientists have argued that natural selection has gravitated toward a small but stable error rate in DNA transcoding, that evolution has, in a sense, tuned the error rate to the optimal balance between too much mutation and too much stability. One might think, given the severe threat associated with transcoding errors, that there would be extraordinary selection pressure to make the DNA repair system foolproof. Parents who made perfect copies of their germ cells would have healthier offspring, while parents with faulty DNA repair would have fewer surviving offspring, thanks to their higher mutation rates. Over time, the genes for foolproof DNA repair would spread through the society at large. The complexity of the DNA repair system suggests that evolution did largely follow this path, only it stopped short of eliminating error altogether. Our cells appear to be designed to leave the door for mutation ever so slightly open, just enough to let a small trickle of change and variation in, without catastrophic effects for the population as a whole. Recent studies suggest that the mutation rate in human germ cells is roughly 1 in 30 million base pairs, which means each time parents pass their DNA on to a child, that genetic inheritance comes with roughly 150 mutations. Much of the machinery in our cells is devoted to preserving and reproducing the signal of the genetic code. But evolution has still made room for noise. Is the error rate the result of selection pressures, or just a reflection of the fact that evolution is not perfect? Humans have relatively good vision, as mammals go, but we can't read magazine text from 500 feet. That's not necessarily a sign that there is something adaptive about that limitation. It's more likely that it's hard to engineer an eye that can see that well, and, as powerful as evolution is, it can't do everything. Presumably, we would have been more evolutionarily fit if we'd been able to run 100 miles per hour, too. But the restrictions of our bone and muscle structure kept us from being able to outrace the cheetah. Why couldn't the same be true of our imperfect DNA repair system? It may well be that perfect replication is simply an ideal limit that natural selection can only approach asymptotically. For our purposes, it doesn't really matter whether selection has actively tuned our DNA repair systems for a certain level of noise or whether they simply fell short of their goal of perfect reproduction. One way or another, the noise had to be preserved, because without it, evolution would grind to a halt. But the tuning hypothesis has had some tantalizing research on its side of late. Bacteria have much higher mutation rates than multicellular life forms, which suggests that the tolerance for error varies according to the specific circumstances of different organisms. One study by Susan Rosenberg at Baylor College found that bacteria increase their mutation rates dramatically when confronted with the stress of low energy supplies. When the living is good, Rosenberg's research suggests, bacteria have less of a need for high mutation rates because their current strategies are well adapted to their environment. But when the environment grows more hostile, the pressure to innovate, to stumble across some new way of eking out a living in a resource-poor setting, shifts the balance of risk versus reward involved in mutation. The risk of your offspring dying from some deadly mutation doesn't look quite as bad if they're going to die of starvation anyway. And if one of those mutations helps the bacteria use the limited energy resources more efficiently, the new gene will quickly spread through the population as the non-mutated bacteria die off. In a sense, Rosenberg's mutating bacteria are following a strategy similar to what the water fleas adopted in their oscillation between sexual and asexual reproduction. When the going gets tough, life tends to gravitate toward more innovative reproductive strategies, sometimes by introducing more noise into the signal of genetic code, and sometimes by allowing genes to circulate more quickly through the population. Sex and error turn out to have a long interconnected history, which is probably not news to those who remember their college love life. One of the key advantages to sexual reproduction is that it enables mutated genes to break off from the genes that produce higher rates of mutation. Picture a bacterium that possesses a gene that inhibits its DNA repair slightly, increasing its overall mutation rate. Most of those mutations will be inconsequential or downright lethal, but imagine one day it hits the jackpot and stumbles across a mutation that increases its reproductive fitness, say, for the sake of argument, that it enables the organism to detect food sources more efficiently. Our fortunate bacterium splits in two and passes its genes on to the next generation. The trouble is, that next generation gets a mixed inheritance. It inherits the new scavenging gene, but it also inherits the gene that produces higher mutation rates. Because negative mutations are much more likely than positive ones, over generations the advantages of the scavenging gene get overwhelmed by the noise introduced by the gene that causes higher mutation rates. But if our lucky bacterium could suddenly switch to sexual reproduction, as the water flea does, the outcome might be very different, because in sexual reproduction you only pass along half your genes to your offspring. The next generation can inherit her father's knack for scavenging and her mother's gift for accurate DNA repair. We have already explored some of the reasons why evolution would gravitate toward the far more complicated system of sexual reproduction. It allows potentially useful innovations to spread through the population and occasionally collide and join forces with other innovations. But when you think about sex in the context of those mutation and scavenging genes, it becomes clear that so much of life on Earth embraced sexual reproduction for another reason. Because sex helped harness the generative power of error while mitigating the risks. Sex keeps the door to the adjacent possible open by just a crack, so that we can adapt to the changing pressures or opportunities of our environment. By keeping the opening so narrow, it also keeps mutation rates in check, which is one crucial reason the asexual bacteria have such markedly higher error rates than the multicellular life. Sex lets us learn from the mistakes of our genes. It's this complicated relationship between accuracy and error, between signal and noise, that explains Charles Nemeth's research on free association and jury deliberation. When one of our peers calls the blue painting green, or comes to the defense of a suspect who is clearly guilty, he or she is, technically speaking, introducing more inaccurate information to the environment. But that noise makes the rest of us smarter, more innovative, precisely because we're forced to rethink our biases, to contemplate an alternate model in which the blue paintings are, in fact, green. Being correct is like the phase lock states of the human brain. All the neurons firing in perfect synchrony. We need the phase lock state for the same reason we need truth. A world of complete error and chaos would be unmanageable, on a social and a neurochemical level. But leaving some room for generative error is important, too. Innovative environments thrive on useful mistakes, and suffer when the demands of quality control overwhelm them. Big organizations like to follow perfectionist regimes like Six Sigma and total quality management, entire systems devoted to eliminating error from the conference room or the assembly line. But it's no accident that one of the mantras of the web startup world is fail faster. It's not that mistakes are the goal, they're still mistakes, after all, which is why you want to get through them quickly. But those mistakes are an inevitable step on the path to true innovation. Benjamin Franklin, who knew a few things about innovation himself, said it best. Perhaps the history of the errors of mankind, all things considered, is more valuable and interesting than that of their discoveries. Truth is uniform and narrow. It constantly exists, and does not seem to require so much an active energy as a passive aptitude of soul in order to encounter it. But error is endlessly diversified. Chapter 6. Exaptation. 2 years before Pliny the Elder died, during a daring rescue of friends after the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, the legendary Roman historian and scholar completed his proto-encyclopedia, Naturalis Historiae. In it he tells the story of a device winemakers had recently invented, a new kind of press that employed a screw to concentrate pressure upon broad planks placed over the grapes, which are covered also with heavy weights above. There is some debate among scholars over whether Pliny may have been rooting for the home team and attributing the invention to his compatriots, since evidence for the use of screw presses in producing wines and olive oils dates back several centuries to the Greeks. But whatever the exact date of its origin, the practical utility of the screw press, unlike so many great ideas from the Greco-Roman period, ensured that it survived intact through the Dark Ages. When the Renaissance finally blossomed, more than a millennium after Pliny's demise, Europe had to rediscover Ptolemaic astronomy and the secrets of building aqueducts. But they didn't have to relearn how to press grapes. In fact, they'd been tinkering steadily with the screw press all along, improving on the model and optimizing it for the mass production of wines. By the mid-1400s, the Rhineland region of Germany, which historically had been hostile to viticulture for climate reasons, was now festooned with vine trellises. Fueled by the increased efficiency of the screw press, German vineyards reached their peak in 1500, covering roughly 4 times as much land as they do in their current incarnation. It was hard work producing drinkable wine in a region that far north, but the mechanical efficiency of the screw press made it financially irresistible. Sometime around the year 1440, a young Rhineland entrepreneur began tinkering with the design of the wine press. He was fresh from a disastrous business venture manufacturing small mirrors with supposedly magical healing powers, which he intended to sell to religious pilgrims. The failure of the trinket business proved fortuitous, however, as it sent the entrepreneur down a much more ambitious path. He had immersed himself in the technology of Rhineland vintners, but Johannes Gutenberg was not interested in wine. He was interested in words. As many scholars have noted, Gutenberg's printing press was a classic combinatorial innovation, more bricolage than breakthrough. Each of the key elements that made it such a transformative machine, the movable type, the ink, the paper, and the press itself, had been developed separately well before Gutenberg printed his first Bible. Movable type, for instance, had been independently conceived by a Chinese blacksmith named Pai Sheng 4 centuries before. But the Chinese failed to adapt the technology for the mass production of texts, in large part because they imprinted the letter forms on the page by hand rubbing, which made the process only slightly more efficient than your average medieval scribe. Thanks to his training as a goldsmith, Gutenberg made some brilliant modifications to the metallurgy behind the movable type system, but without the press itself, his meticulous lead fonts would have been useless for creating mass-produced Bibles. An important part of Gutenberg's genius, then, lay not in conceiving an entirely new technology from scratch, but instead from borrowing a mature technology from an entirely different field, and putting it to work to solve an unrelated problem. We don't know exactly what chain of events led Gutenberg to make that associative link. Few documentary records remain of Gutenberg's life between 1440 and 1448, the period during which he assembled the primary components of his invention. But it is clear that Gutenberg had no formal experience pressing grapes. His radical breakthrough relied, instead, on the ubiquity of the screw press in Rhineland winemaking culture, and on his ability to reach out beyond his specific field of expertise and concoct new uses for an older technology. He took a machine designed to get people drunk and turned it into an engine for mass communication. Evolutionary biologists have a word for this kind of borrowing. First proposed in an influential 1971 essay by Stephen Jay Gould and Elizabeth VRB, Exaptation. An organism develops a trait optimized for a specific use, but then the trait gets hijacked for a completely different function. The classic example, featured prominently in Gould and VRB's essay, is bird feathers, which we believe initially evolved for temperature regulation, helping non-flying dinosaurs from the Cretaceous period insulate themselves against cold weather. But when some of their descendants, including a creature we now call Archaeopteryx, began experimenting with flight, feathers turned out to be useful for controlling the airflow over the surface of the wing, allowing those first birds to glide. The initial transformation is almost accidental. A tool sculpted by evolutionary pressures for one purpose turns out to have an unexpected property that helps the organism survive in a new way. But once that new property gets put to use, once Archaeopteryx starts using its feathers to glide, the trait evolves according to a different set of criteria. All flight feathers, for instance, have pronounced asymmetry to them. The vein on one side of the central shaft is larger than the vein on the opposite side. This lets the feather act as a kind of airfoil, providing lift during the flapping of wings. Birds that fly at unusually high velocities, like hawks, have more extreme asymmetries than slower birds. Yet down feathers that simply provide insulation are perfectly symmetrical. When your feathers are there just to keep you warm, there's no advantage to building slightly off-kilter feathers. Mutations or other general variability in the gene pool inevitably produces feathers that are slightly less symmetrical than average. But those traits don't intensify and spread across generations because they don't convey any reproductive advantage over normal feathers. But once flight speed becomes a property with major implications for survival, those asymmetrical veins turn out to be extremely useful. Where asymmetry had previously drifted in and out of the gene pool, natural selection now begins sculpting those feathers to make them more aerodynamic. A feather adapted for warmth is now exapted for flight. The concept of exaptation is crucial in rebutting the classic biblical argument against Darwinism, one that dates back to the furor surrounding the publication of On the Origin of Species itself. If extraordinary examples of natural engineering like eyes or wings are not the product of an intelligent creator, then how could these traits have survived through what must have been a pronounced developmental state of non-functionality? As the wing evolves, by definition it has to go through a long period where it's utterly useless at flying. Because natural selection doesn't know that it's trying to build a wing. It can't push those emerging wings toward the ultimate goal of flying the way a mechanical engineer can continue tinkering with a toy airplane until it successfully takes to the air. If your aspiring wing doesn't help you to fly, and thus outmaneuver your predators or discover new sources of food, the new mutations that made that appendage slightly more wing-like won't be more likely to spread through the population. Natural selection doesn't give good grades for effort. But when you think about evolutionary innovation in terms of exaptations, the story becomes far less mysterious. Once again, chance and happy accidents are central to the narrative. Random mutations lead to the evolution of feathers selected for warmth, and by chance those feathers turn out to be useful for flying, particularly after they've been modified to create an airfoil. Sometimes those exaptations become possible because other exaptations are happening within the species. The wing itself is thought to be an exaptation of a dinosaur wrist bone originally adapted for greater flexibility. When Good offered up his tires to sandals metaphor, he was essentially talking about the way in which exaptations have defined the paths of evolutionary innovation. New abilities and traits come about not because there is some inexorable march toward more and more complexity in the biosphere, but rather because natural selection has the Nairobi cobbler's instinct for taking old parts and putting them to new uses. Oftentimes, those new uses become possible thanks to external changes in an organism's environment. When the lobe-finned fish Sarcopterygii first began exploring life at the water's edge, 400 million years ago, the creature had a small swim fan at the end of its fin, supported by narrow rays of bone. As its descendants began to spend more time away from the water, exploiting the copious energy sources of the plants and arthropods that had already conquered life on land, the tip of the lobe fin turned out to be useful for an activity that aquatic life had rendered unthinkable: walking. Before long, natural selection had refashioned the swim fan into an autopod, the basic architecture of all mammalian ankles and feet. Over time, the autopod itself would be exapted in numerous ways, creating primate hands and fingers optimized for grasping, or those Archaeopteryx wings. In some cases, the autopod was even exapted back to its ancient swim fan origins, as in the flippers of seals and sea lions. If mutation and error and serendipity unlock new doors in the biosphere's adjacent possible, exaptations help us explore the new possibilities that lurk behind those doors. A match you light to illuminate a darkened room turns out to have a completely different use when you open a doorway and discover a room with a pile of logs and a fireplace in it. A tool that helps you see in one context ends up helping you keep warm in another. That's the essence of exaptation. It's tempting to assume that the machinery of cultural innovation is closer to that engineer tinkering with her model airplane than it is to the lucky Archaeopteryx leaping off the treetop and discovering that its feathers are more than just a down jacket. No one contests the role of intelligent design in the history of human culture. But the history of human creativity abounds with exaptations. In the early 1800 seconds, a French weaver named Joseph-Marie Jacquard developed the first punch cards to weave complex silk patterns with mechanical looms. Several decades later, Charles Babbage borrowed Jacquard's invention to program the analytical engine. Punch cards would remain crucial to programmable computers until the 1970s. Lee De Forest created the Audione with one clear aim: to create a device that would detect electromagnetic signals and amplify them. It never occurred to him that the triode architecture could just as easily be applied to the problem of building a hydrogen bomb. In evolutionary terms, the vacuum tube was originally adapted to make signals louder, but it was eventually exapted to turn those signals into information, zeros and ones that could be manipulated in astonishing ways. A Fender guitar amp from the 50s that relied on a vacuum tube to boost the signal of the first rock and roll guitarists was, ultimately, a variation on De Forest's original amplification theme. But those 17,000 vacuum tubes inside ENIAC, doing the math on the physics of a hydrogen bomb, they were serving a function that never crossed De Forest's mind, however imaginative it might have been. Today, emerging patent marketplaces like Nike's Green Exchange are enabling commercial exaptations that would have been unthinkable in the fortified environment of traditional R&D labs. The history of the World Wide Web is, in a sense, a story of continuous exaptation. Tim Berners-Lee designs the original protocols with a specifically academic environment in mind, creating a platform for sharing research in a hypertext format. But when the first web pages crawl out of that scholarly primordial soup and begin to engage with ordinary consumers, Berners-Lee's invention turns out to possess a remarkable number of unanticipated qualities. A platform adapted for scholarship was Exapted for shopping and sharing photos and watching pornography, along with 1,000 other uses that would have astounded Berners-Lee when he created his first HTML-based directories in the early 90s. When Sergey Brin and Larry Page decided to use links between web pages as digital votes endorsing the content of those pages, they were exapting Berners-Lee's original design. They took a trait adapted for navigation, the hypertext link, and used it as a vehicle for assessing quality. The result was PageRank, the original algorithm that made Google into the behemoth that it is today. The literary historian Franco Morti has persuasively documented the role of exaptation in the evolution of the novel. An author conceives a new kind of narrative device to address a specific, local need in a work he or she is writing. Something about the device resonates with other authors, and it begins to circulate through the literary gene pool. And then, as the literary environment changes and new imaginative possibilities become necessary, the device turns out to have a different function, far removed from its original use. The French novelist Edouard Dujardin first uses the stream of consciousness technique in his 1888 novel Les Lauriers sans Coupes. In Dujardin's rendition, the technique is restricted to short periods of introspection between the main events of the story, brief parentheses within the plot. But 3 decades later, James Joyce would take the device and transform it into the most memorable and mesmerizing perceptual modes, using the device in his novel Ulysses to capture the churn and distractibility of mental life in a bustling city. When Dickens conjured up his Inspector Bucket to weave together the multiplying strands of metropolitan coincidence in Bleak House, he had no idea his contrivance would help create a whole new genre of detective fiction, one that would extend all the way from Wilkie Collins's The Moonstone to Sherlock Holmes to Murder, She Wrote. New genres need old devices. Rhetorical or figurative exaptations are not the exclusive property of the arts. The history of scientific and technological innovation abounds with them as well. In The Act of Creation, Arthur Koestler argued that all decisive events in the history of scientific thought can be described in terms of mental cross-fertilization between different disciplines. Concepts from one domain migrate to another as a kind of structuring metaphor, thereby unlocking some secret door that had long been hidden from view. In his memoirs, Francis Crick reports that he first hit upon the complementary replication system of DNA, each base matched with a T, and each C with a G, by thinking of the way a work of sculpture can be reproduced by making an impression in plaster, and then using that impression, when dry, as a mold to create copies. Johannes Kepler credited his laws of planetary motion to a generative metaphor imported from religion. He imagined the sun, stars, and the dark space between them as the celestial equivalents of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. When computer science pioneers like Doug Engelbart and Alan Kay invented the graphical interface, they imported a metaphor from the real-world environment of offices. Instead of organizing information on the screen as a series of command line inputs, the way a programmer would, they borrowed the iconography of a desktop with pieces of paper stacked on it. Kekule didn't think the benzene molecule was literally a snake from Greek mythology, but his knowledge of that ancient symbol helped him solve one of the essential problems of organic chemistry. In the early 1970s, a Berkeley sociologist named Claude Fisher began investigating the social effects of living in dense urban centers. The topic was one that had long interested urban theorists, most famously in Louis Wirth's classic essay from 1938, Urbanism as a Way of Life, which argued that metropolitan living led towards social disorganization and alienation, the social ties and comforts of smaller communities breaking down in the tumult of the big city. Wirth's argument had not aged well. It turned out that densely populated neighborhoods had very complex and rich social bonds if one looked for them, and so Fisher set out to determine what social patterns were truly precipitated by the environment of large cities. His research led him to one overwhelming conclusion, published in a seminal paper in 1975. Big cities nurture subcultures much more effectively than suburbs or small towns. Lifestyles or interests that deviate from the mainstream need critical mass to survive. They atrophy in smaller communities not because those communities are more repressive, but rather because the odds of finding like-minded people are much lower with a smaller pool of individuals. If 0.1% of the population are passionately interested in, say, beetle collecting or improv theater, there might only be a dozen such individuals in a mid-sized town. But in a big city there might be thousands. As Fisher noted, that clustering creates a positive feedback loop, as the more unconventional residents of the suburbs or rural areas migrate to the city in search of fellow travelers. The theory explains the evil and good of cities simultaneously, Fisher wrote. Criminal unconventionality and innovative unconventionality are both nourished by vibrant subcultures. The same pattern holds true for trades and businesses in large cities. As Jane Jacobs observed in The Death and Life of Great American Cities, the larger a city, the greater the variety of its manufacturing, and also the greater both the number and the proportion of its small manufacturers. Towns and suburbs, for instance, are natural homes for huge supermarkets and for little else in the way of groceries, for standard movie houses or drive-ins and for little else in the way of theater. There are simply not enough people to support further variety, although there may be people who would draw upon it were it there. Cities, however, are the natural homes of supermarkets and standard movie houses plus delicatessens, Viennese bakeries, foreign groceries, art movies, and so on, all of which can be found coexisting, the standard with the strange, the large with the small. Wherever lively and popular parts of cities are found, the small much outnumber the large. Both Fisher and Jacobs emphasize the fertile interactions that occur between subcultures in a dense city center, the inevitable spillover that happens whenever human beings crowd together in large groups. Subcultures and eclectic businesses generate ideas, interests, and skills that inevitably diffuse through the society, influencing other groups. As Fisher puts it, the larger the town, the more likely it is to contain, in meaningful numbers and unity, drug addicts, radicals, intellectuals, swingers, health food faddists, or whatever, and the more likely they are to influence the conventional center of the society. Cities, then, are environments that are ripe for exaptation because they cultivate specialized skills and interests, and they create a liquid network where information can leak out of those subcultures and influence their neighbors in surprising ways. This is one explanation for superlinear scaling and urban creativity. The cultural diversity those subcultures create is valuable not just because it makes urban life less boring. The value also lies in the unlikely migrations that happen between the different clusters. A world where a diverse mix of distinct professions and passions overlap is a world where exaptations thrive. Those shared environments often take the form of a real-world public space, what the sociologist Ray Oldenburg famously called the third place, a connective environment distinct from the more insular world of home or office. The 18th century English coffeehouse fertilized countless Enlightenment-era innovations, everything from the science of electricity to the insurance industry to democracy itself. Freud maintained a celebrated salon Wednesday nights at 19 Berggasse in Vienna, where physicians, philosophers, and scientists gathered to help shape the emerging field of psychoanalysis. Think, too, of the Paris cafes where so much of modernism was born, or the legendary Homebrew Computer Club in the 1970s, where a ragtag assemblage of amateur hobbyists, teenagers, digital entrepreneurs, and academic scientists managed to spark the personal computer revolution. Participants flock to these spaces partly for the camaraderie of others who share their passions, and no doubt that support network increases the engagement and productivity of the group. But encouragement does not necessarily lead to creativity. Collisions do. The collisions that happen when different fields of expertise converge in some shared physical or intellectual space. That's where the true sparks fly. The modernism of the 1920s exhibited so much cultural innovation in such a short period of time because the writers, poets, artists, and architects were all rubbing shoulders at the same cafes. They weren't off on separate islands, teaching creative writing seminars or doing design reviews. That physical proximity made the space rich with exaptation. The literary stream of consciousness influencing the dizzying new perspectives of cubism, the futurist embrace of technological speed and poetry shaping new patterns of urban planning. Exaptation also prospers on another scale, the shared media environment of a physical community. In the late 1970s, the British musician and artist Brian Eno moved to New York City for the first time. He took over a flat in a converted townhouse in the heart of the village. The city was at the height, or more like the nadir, of its rioting, son of Sam-fearing, bankruptcy-flirting madness. Still, having spent time in 1970s London and Berlin, Eno was well acclimated to urban anarchy. In fact, the most jarring contrast to his European past was the turbulent mix of voices on the radio. After years of listening to the somber, professional voices of the BBC, the outlandish rants of American radio seemed to Eno like a new universe of insanity. And so he started taping them. Like many experimental musicians at that point, Eno had been exploring the possibilities of using tape loops as a musical instrument. The tape recorder was always the instrument I felt most comfortable with, he once said in an interview. Keyboards after that, with bass as a distant third. The Beatles had reserved the longest track on the White Album for Lennon's tape loop collage Revolution No. 9, and the proto-synthesizer Mellotron, developed in the mid-60s, had separate tape loops set up to be triggered by individual keys on the keyboard. But none of those experiments had ever really employed the spoken voice as a harmonic or percussive element. The drones and murmurs of Revolution Number 9 were, after all, barely musical by traditional standards. But Eno's hours with the evangelists and the anarchists and the shock jocks in embryo had launched those voices in his head, and as he began work on a collaboration with David Byrne, he started to toy with the idea of exploring their musical possibilities. The result was My Life in the Bush of Ghosts, an utterly original mix of African rhythm sections and oddball acoustic instruments, but notably missing Byrne's taut new wave vocal stylings, so prominently featured in the Talking Heads albums the two had previously collaborated on. Instead of traditional singing, Byrne and Eno built the songs around the layered, looped ensemble of spoken words that Eno had grabbed from the airwaves. It was a case study in creative exaptation, words designed in one medium to spread the word of Jesus, or to thunder against the military-industrial complex, migrated over into a new environment and became, against all odds, music. My Life in the Bush of Ghosts marked the birth of a certain historically crucial kind of musical borrowing. It was not just a new music, but a whole new way of thinking about what music could be built out of. Several years later, when Public Enemy producer Hank Shocklee sat down to record the album It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back, he deliberately mimicked the layered, percussive vocal samples of Eno and Byrne's production. It Takes a Nation went on to become one of the most sonically influential records of its decade, reverberating through the wider culture in everything from cell phone jingles to Billboard chart toppers to avant-garde experimentation, just as Highway 61 Revisited and Pet Sounds had done a generation before. Eno's original innovation was brilliant, to be sure, and from a distance it almost looks like the classic lone genius eureka moment, the innovator locked away in his lab, stumbling across an idea that would transform the wider culture. But it is crucial to the story that Eno was not, technically speaking, alone with his tape recorder. He was tapped into a network of wildly different voices, all of them ranting at different frequencies. Eno didn't need a coffee house. He had AM radio. In the late 90s, a Stanford Business School professor named Martin Ruff decided to investigate the relationship between business innovation and diversity. Ruff was interested in the coffeehouse model of diversity, not the melting pot political kind, the diversity of professions and disciplines, not of race or sexual orientation. Ruff interviewed 766 graduates of the school who had gone on to have entrepreneurial careers. He created an elaborate system for scoring innovation based on a combination of factors, the introduction of new products, say, or the filing of trademarks and patents. And then he tracked each graduate's social network, not just the number of acquaintances but the kind of acquaintances they had. Some graduates had large social networks that were clustered within their organization. Others had small insular groups dominated by friends and family. Some had wide-ranging connections with acquaintances outside their inner circle of friends and colleagues. What Ruff discovered was a ringing endorsement of the coffeehouse model of social networking. The most creative individuals in Ruff's survey consistently had broad social networks that extended outside their organization and involved people from diverse fields of expertise. Diverse, horizontal social networks, in Ruff's analysis, were 3 times more innovative than uniform, vertical networks. In groups united by shared values and long-term familiarity, conformity and convention tended to dampen any potential creative sparks. The limited reach of the network meant that interesting concepts from the outside rarely entered the entrepreneur's consciousness. But the entrepreneurs who built bridges outside their islands, as Ruff called them, were able to borrow or co-opt new ideas from these external environments and put them to use in a new context. A similar study, conducted by a University of Chicago Business School professor named Ronald Burt, looked at the origin of good ideas inside the organizational network of the Raytheon Corporation. Burt found that innovative thinking was much more likely to emerge from individuals who bridged structural holes between tightly knit clusters. Employees who primarily shared information with people in their own division had a harder time coming up with useful suggestions for Raytheon's business, when measured against employees who maintained active links to a more diverse group. To a certain extent, Ruff's and Burt's research is a validation of the celebrated strength of weak ties argument first proposed by Mark Granovetter and popularized by Malcolm Gladwell in The Tipping Point. But looking at the weak ties of an extended social network through the lens of exaptation changes the picture in an important way. It is not merely that weak ties allow information to travel throughout a network more efficiently, that is, without becoming trapped on the remote island of a close-knit group. From the perspective of innovation, it's even more important that the information arriving from one of those weak ties is coming from a different context, What the innovation scholar Richard Ogle calls an idea space, a complex of tools, beliefs, metaphors, and objects of study. A new technology developed in one idea space can migrate over to another idea space through these long-distance connections. In that new environment, the technology may turn out to have unanticipated properties, or may trigger a connection that leads to a new breakthrough. The value of the weak tie lies not just in the speed with which it transmits information across a network, it also promotes the exaptation of those ideas. Gutenberg was trained as a metallurgist, but he had weak ties to the vintners of Rhineland, Germany. Without that link, he would have been merely a pioneering typesetter, making an incremental improvement on Pai Sheng's movable type. By not restricting himself exclusively to the island of metallurgy, he became something much more important, a printer. The model of weak tie exaptation also helps us understand the classic story of 20th century scientific epiphany, Watson and Crick's discovery of the double helix structure of DNA. As Ogle and others have noted, in the small scientific community working on the problem of DNA in the early 1950s, the person who had the clearest and most direct view of the molecule itself was neither James Watson nor Francis Crick. It was, instead, a biophysicist at London University named Rosalind Franklin, who was using state-of-the-art X-ray crystallography to study the mysterious strands of DNA. But Franklin's vision was limited by two factors. First, there was the imperfect state of the X-ray technology, which only gave her hints about the helix structure and base pair symmetry. But Franklin was also limited by the conceptual island on which she based her work. Her approach was purely inductive: master the X-ray technology and then use the information collected to build a model of DNA. But to see the double helix in the early 1950s took something more than just analyzing it in an X-ray machine. To solve the mystery, Watson and Crick had to piece it together with tools drawn from multiple disciplines: biochemistry, genetics, information theory, and mathematics, not to mention Franklin's X-ray images. Even Crick's sculpture metaphor proved crucial to cracking the code. Next to Franklin, Watson and Crick seemed almost dilettantes and dabblers. Crick had switched from physics to biology in his graduate years. Neither had a comprehensive grasp of biochemistry. But DNA was not a problem that could be solved within a single discipline. Watson and Crick had to borrow from other domains to make sense of the molecule. As Ogle puts it, once key ideas from idea spaces that otherwise had little contact with one another were connected, they began, quasi-autonomously, to make new sense in terms of one another, leading to the emergence of a whole that was more than the sum of its parts. It is a fitting footnote to the story that Watson and Crick were notorious for taking long, rambling coffee breaks, where they tossed around ideas in a more playful setting outside the lab, a practice that was generally scorned by their more fastidious colleagues. With their weak tie connections to disparate fields, and their exaptative intelligence, Watson and Crick worked their way to a Nobel Prize in their own private coffeehouse. The coffeehouse model of creativity helps explain one of those strange paradoxes of 21st century business innovation. Even as much of the high-tech culture has embraced decentralized, liquid networks in their approach to innovation, the company that is consistently ranked as the most innovative in the world, Apple, remains defiantly top-down and almost comically secretive in its development of new products. You won't ever see Steve Jobs or Jonathan Ive crowdsourcing development of the next-generation iPhone. If open and dense networks lead to more innovation, how can we explain Apple, which on the spectrum of openness is far closer to Willy Wonka's factory than it is to Wikipedia? The easy answer is that Jobs and Ive simply possess a collaborative genius that has enabled the company to ship such a reliable stream of revolutionary products. No doubt both men are immensely talented at what they do, but neither of them can design, build, program, and market a product as complex as the iPhone on their own. The way Jobs and Steve Wozniak crafted the original Apple personal computer in the now legendary garage. Apple clearly has unparalleled leadership, but there must also be something in the environment at Apple that is allowing such revolutionary ideas to make it to the marketplace. As it turns out, while Apple has largely adopted a fortress mentality toward the outside world, the company's internal development process is explicitly structured to facilitate clash and connection between different perspectives. Jobs himself has taken to describing their method via the allegory of the concept car. You go to an auto show and see some glamorous and wildly innovative concept car on display and you think, I'd buy that in a second. And then 5 years later, the car finally comes to market and it's been whittled down from a Ferrari to a Pinto. All the truly breakthrough features have been toned down or eliminated altogether, and what's left looks mostly like last year's model. The same sorry fate could have befallen the iPod as well. Ive and Jobs could have sketched out a brilliant, revolutionary music player and then 2 years later released a dud. What kept the spark alive? The answer is that Apple's development cycle looks more like a coffeehouse than an assembly line. The traditional way to build a product like the iPod is to follow a linear chain of expertise. The designers come up with a basic look and feature set and then pass it on to the engineers, who figure out how to actually make it work. And then it gets passed along to the manufacturing folks, who figure out how to build it in large numbers, after which it gets sent to the marketing and sales people who figure out how to persuade people to buy it. This model is so ubiquitous because it performs well in situations where efficiency is key, but it tends to have disastrous effects on creativity because the original idea gets chipped away at each step in the chain. The engineering team takes a look at the original design and says, well, we can't really do that, but we can do 80% of what you want. And then the manufacturing team says, sure, we can do some of that. In the end, the original design has been watered down beyond recognition. Apple's approach, by contrast, is messier and more chaotic at the beginning, but it avoids this chronic problem of good ideas being hollowed out as they progress through the development chain. Apple calls it concurrent or parallel production. All the groups, design, manufacturing, engineering, sales, meet continuously through the product development cycle, brainstorming, trading ideas and solutions, strategizing over the most pressing issues, and generally keeping the conversation open to a diverse group of perspectives. The process is noisy and involves far more open-ended and contentious meetings than traditional production cycles, and far more dialogue between people versed in different disciplines, with all the translation difficulties that creates. But the results speak for themselves. Many of history's great innovators managed to build a cross-disciplinary coffeehouse environment within their own private work routine. It is an oft-told story that Darwin delayed publishing his theory of evolution because he feared the controversy it would unleash, particularly after the death of his beloved daughter Annie traumatized his religious wife, Emma. But Darwin also had an immense number of side interests to distract him from his opus. He studied coral reefs, bred pigeons, performed elaborate taxonomical studies of beetles and barnacles, wrote important papers on the geology of South America, spent years researching the impact of earthworms on the soil. None of these passions were central to the argument that would eventually be published as On the Origin of Species, but each contributed useful links of association and expertise to the problem of evolution. The same eclectic pattern appears in countless other biographies. Joseph Priestley bounced between chemistry, physics, theology, and political theory. Even in the years before he became a political statesman, Benjamin Franklin conducted electricity experiments, theorized the existence of the Gulf Stream, designed stoves, and of course made a small fortune as a printer. While John Snow was solving the mystery of cholera in the streets of London in the 1850s, he was also inventing state-of-the-art technology for the administration of ether, publishing research on lead poisoning and the resuscitation of stillborn children, yet all the while tending to his patients as a general practitioner. Legendary innovators like Franklin, Snow, and Darwin all possess some common intellectual qualities, a certain quickness of mind, unbounded curiosity, but they also share one other defining attribute. They have a lot of hobbies. The historian Howard Gruber likes to call such concurrent projects networks of enterprise, but I prefer to describe them using a contemporary term that has been much maligned of late: multitasking. This is not, of course, the multitasking of the modern computer screen, switching from email to spreadsheet to Twitter in a matter of seconds. What I'm describing is much more leisurely than that frenetic, digital age mode. The individual tasks themselves might linger on for days or weeks before giving way to the next project. But there is steady variation nonetheless, not just in the subject matter but in the kind of work performed in each task. For John Snow, there were fundamentally different modes of intellectual activity involved in his many projects. Building mechanical contraptions to control the temperature of chloroform required different skills, a different mindset from tending to patients or writing papers for The Lancet. It is tempting to call this mode of work serial tasking, in the sense that the projects rotate one after the other, but emphasizing the serial nature of the work obscures one crucial aspect of this mental environment. In a slow multitasking mode, one project takes center stage for a series of hours or days, yet the other projects linger in the margins of consciousness throughout. That cognitive overlap is what makes this mode so innovative. The current project can extract ideas from the projects at the margins, make new connections. It is not so much a question of thinking outside the box, as it is allowing the mind to move through multiple boxes. That movement from box to box forces the mind to approach intellectual roadblocks from new angles, or to borrow tools from one discipline to solve problems in another. The standard story about Snow is that he solved the mystery of cholera's waterborne transmission by doing shoe leather epidemiological detective work during the 1854 Soho outbreak. But the truth is he had built a convincing rendition of the waterborne theory well before 1854. One reason he was able to see around the biases of the reigning miasma theory of the day, which maintained that cholera was caused by the inhalation of noxious vapors, is that his work with anesthesia had given him a hands-on knowledge of the way that gases diffused through the atmosphere. Snow reasoned that a disease transmitted by poisonous gas would leave a distinct pattern in the geographic spread of mortality, massive death in the immediate proximity of the bad smells, tapering off very quickly as one moved away from the original source. By the same token, Snow's training as a physician helped him shed the miasma blinders as well. From tending to patients ill with cholera, Snow observed that the effects of the disease on the human body indicated that the agent had been ingested, not inhaled, given that it did almost all of its direct damage in the digestive system and left the lungs largely unaffected. In a real sense, for Snow to make his great breakthrough in understanding cholera, he had to think like a molecular chemist and like a physician. As a slow multitasker, he had those interpretative systems readily available to him when his focus turned to the mystery of cholera. As we saw with the feathers of Archaeopteryx, Snow couldn't have anticipated that his mechanical tinkering with chloroform inhalers would prove useful in ridding the modern world of a deadly bacterium. But that is the unpredictable power of exaptations. Chance favors the connected mind. Chapter 7. Platforms. On April 12, 1836, HMS Beagle took leave of the Keeling Islands after a 2-week idyll that had given Darwin the crucial evidence he needed to support the first great idea of his young career. As the ship left the placid green waters of the lagoon, heading home to England via the island of Mauritius, Captain Fitzroy plumbed the depths on the periphery of the atoll with a line more than 7,000 feet long. He encountered no bottom. Fitzroy's measurements confirmed, in Darwin's words, that the island forms a lofty submarine mountain, with sides steeper even than those of the most abrupt volcanic cone. The data was crucial to Darwin, because he was building a theory in his mind about lofty submarine mountains and their geological legacy. The theory had emerged years before as a hunch, that his mentor Charles Lyell's theory of atoll formation had a critical flaw that revolved around the statistical likelihood that a mountain would just happen to settle only a few feet above sea level. The elevation variation in volcanic islands was immense. Some tapered off a dozen feet above sea level, others, like Mauna Kea, surged 10,000 feet into the sky. Most volcanic peaks lay thousands of feet below the surface. Yet Darwin, like most geologists of his age, knew that the oceans were populated by a huge number of tropical atolls that had all somehow simultaneously landed within a few feet of sea level. It was like scattering 100 footballs across a field and having 20 of them cluster exactly on the 43-yard line. Darwin didn't have the theory of plate tectonics, but he knew that land masses were rising and descending around the world. But it made no sense that these epic forces were somehow being arrested, in a significant number of cases, by the dividing line of sea level. A volcano being pushed upward by immense planetary conveyor belts should, by all rights, quickly burst through the ocean's surface and continue climbing, as Mauna Kea and countless other island volcanoes did. By the same logic, a mountain sliding into the sea should keep sliding. Why were so many of these mountains getting stuck? We don't know exactly when the answer came to Darwin. It may well have occurred to him standing on the white sands of a Keeling Islands beach. More likely, knowing Darwin, the idea rolled in slowly, inch by inch, and some small piece of it came to him standing in those green waters. The idea was simple, but strangely hard to visualize. It began with one defining principle: the ground beneath Darwin's feet was not the product of geological forces. An organism had engineered it. That organism was Scleractinia, more commonly known as reef-building coral. Alive, an individual Scleractinia is a soft polyp, no more than a few millimeters long. Reef-building corals grow in vast colonies, with new polyps appearing as buds on the sides of their parents. It is one of the strange ironies of marine biology that the coral's essential contribution to the undersea ecosystem takes place after its death. The polyp builds a calcium-based exoskeleton during its life, producing a mineral called aragonite, which is sturdy enough to remain intact centuries after its original host has perished. A coral reef, then, is a kind of vast underwater mausoleum, millions of skeletons united to form the pocked, labyrinthine sprawl of a reef. During his fortnight on the Keeling Islands, Darwin had observed that the soil of the island was entirely devoid of traditional rocks. As he put it in his diary, throughout the whole group of islands, every single atom, even from the most minute particle to large fragments of rocks, bear the stamp of once having been subjected to the power of organic arrangement. The vast majority of those particles and rocks were aragonite skeletons, the remains of a coral polyp that had died decades or centuries before. This alone was evidence that Lyell's theory was flawed. If Darwin was standing at the tip of a dormant undersea volcano, the rocks at his feet would have been basalt or obsidian or pumice, rocks created from the cooling of molten lava. The rocks would have been forged in a fiery core of magma, not excreted by minuscule polyps. The fact that the soil of an Indian Ocean atoll was organic in nature, engineered by coral and not the product of volcanic activity, did not, on its own, offer a satisfactory answer to the mystery of the atoll's existence. Why should a colony of coral form such a perfect oval in the middle of an immense ocean, hundreds of miles from another landmass? To solve that mystery, Darwin drew on Lyell's original theory, but he added an essential twist. He turned a still frame into a moving picture. To understand atoll formation, Darwin realized, you had to imagine a volcanic island slowly subsiding into the sea. As the banks of the volcano disappeared beneath the ocean waves, those slopes would become prime breeding ground for coral colonies, which thrive in shallow water at depths up to around 150 feet. Eventually, the summit of the mountain slides into the sea, leaving a circle of shallow water defined by the periphery of the volcanic crater. Because the mountain is subsiding so slowly, the coral are able to build their reefs faster than the mountain can descend. Like overzealous developers, the coral colonies keep adding new floors to the structure they've erected at the top of the volcano, limited only by the water's surface. As the original peak descends further and further into the sea, the older reefs die off, but continue to give structural support to the new, thriving reefs above them. Darwin had no way of measuring this precisely, but he predicted that fossil coral would extend as far as 5,000 feet below sea level before hitting a volcanic foundation, a number that was confirmed more than a century later with modern drilling technology. As the Beagle departed, Darwin captured the miraculous nature of this explanation in his diary. "We must look at a lagoon as a monument raised by myriads of tiny architects," he wrote, "to mark the spot where a former land lies buried in the depths of the ocean." Published several years later as a monograph, Darwin's theory of atoll formation marked his first significant contribution to science, and it has largely stood the test of time. The idea itself drew on a coffeehouse of different disciplines. To solve the mystery, he had to think like a naturalist, a marine biologist, and a geologist all at once. He had to understand the life cycle of coral colonies and observe the tiny evidence of organic sculpture on the rocks of the Keeling Islands. He had to think on the immense time scales of volcanic mountains rising and falling into the sea. And, of course, he needed Fitzroy's technical expertise with the sounding line. To understand the idea in its full complexity required a kind of probing intelligence, willing to think across those different disciplines and scales. Darwin described it best in the chapter on his Keeling Islands investigations from the voyage of the Beagle. "We feel surprise when travelers tell us of the vast dimensions of the pyramids and other great ruins, but how utterly insignificant are the greatest of these, when compared to these mountains of stone accumulated by the agency of various minute and tender animals. This is a wonder which does not at first strike the eye of the body, but, after reflection, the eye of reason." From Darwin's perspective, those minute and tender animals had built a platform, in the most prosaic sense of the word. Darwin was walking on that saucer-shaped summit, and not treading water in the middle of the Indian Ocean, because those animals had engineered a platform for him to stand on. But a coral reef is a platform in a much more profound sense. The mounds, plates, and crevices of the reef create a habitat for millions of other species, an undersea metropolis of immense diversity. To date, attempts to measure accurately the full diversity of reef ecosystems have been foiled by the complexity of these habitats. Scientists now believe that somewhere between 1 million and 10 million distinct species live in coral reefs around the world, despite the fact that those reefs only occupy 0.1% of the planet's surface. This is the Darwin paradox, that such nutrient-poor waters could generate so much marvelous, improbable, heterogeneous life. For 40 years, ecologists have used the term keystone species to designate an organism that has a disproportionate impact on its ecosystem, a carnivore, for instance, who is the only predator of another species that would otherwise overwhelm the habitat with unchecked population growth. Remove the keystone predator, and the habitat falls apart. But about 20 years ago, a scientist named Clive Jones at the Carey Institute of Ecosystem Studies decided that ecology needed another term to describe a very specific kind of keystone species, the kind that actually creates the habitat itself. Jones called these organisms ecosystem engineers. Beavers are the classic example of ecosystem engineers. By felling poplars and willows to build dams, beavers single-handedly transform temperate forests into wetlands, which then attract and support a remarkable array of neighbors. Pileated woodpeckers drilling nesting cavities into dead trees, wood ducks and Canada geese settling in abandoned beaver lodges, herons and kingfishers and swallows enjoying the benefits of the artificial pond, along with frogs, lizards, and other slow water species like dragonflies, mussels, and aquatic beetles. As do those underwater colonies of coral, the beaver creates a platform that sustains an amazingly diverse assemblage of life. Platform building is, by definition, a kind of exercise in emergent behavior. The tiny scleractinia polyp isn't actively trying to create an underwater Las Vegas, but nonetheless out of its steady labor, imbibing algae and erecting those aragonite skeletons, a higher-level system emerges. What had been a largely desolate stretch of nutrient-poor seawater is transformed into a glittering hub of activity. The beaver builds a dam to better protect itself against its predators, but that engineering has the emergent effect of creating a space where kingfishers and dragonflies and beetles can make a life for themselves. The platform builders and ecosystem engineers do not just open a door in the adjacent possible, they build an entire new floor. The cafeteria at the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory in Laurel, Maryland, had long been a site of productive shop talk between the physicists, technicians, mathematicians, and proto-hackers who worked there. But the Monday lunchtime chatter on October 7, 1957, was unusually heated, thanks to the weekend headlines announcing the Soviet launch of Sputnik 1, the first man-made Earth-orbiting satellite. Two young physicists, William Geer and George Weifenbach, found themselves in a spirited discussion about the microwave signals that would likely be emanating from Sputnik. After canvassing some of their colleagues, it appeared that no one had bothered to come in over the weekend to see if Sputnik-S signals could be picked up by the APL's equipment. Weifenbach, as it turned out, was in the middle of a PhD on microwave spectroscopy and had a 20 MHz receiver sitting in his office. Geer and Weifenbach spent the afternoon hunched over the receiver, listening for Sputnik's audio fingerprint. To combat the doubters, who would inevitably question whether the whole launch was an elaborate hoax, a product of communist propaganda, the Soviets had engineered Sputnik so that it would transmit an unusually accessible signal, an unbroken tone broadcast within 1 kHz of 20 MHz. By the end of the afternoon, Weifenbach and Geer had a clear lock on it. The sound itself was a staccato pulse of electronic bleeps, but the context transformed it into the most marvelous music the two men had ever heard. It seemed unbelievable, sitting in a room in suburban Maryland, listening to man-made signals coming from space. Word began to spread through the APL that the young physicists had captured Sputnik's signal, and a steady stream of visitors appeared at Weifenbach's door to eavesdrop on the satellite's warble. Realizing that they were listening to history, Geer and Weifenbach hooked up the receiver to an audio amplifier and began recording the signal on audio tape. They included timestamps with each recording. As they listened and recorded, the two men realized that they could use the Doppler effect to calculate the speed at which the satellite was moving through space. First observed more than a century before by the Austrian physicist Christian Doppler, the Doppler effect describes the predictable way a waveform's frequency changes when the source or the receiver is in motion. Imagine a speaker playing a single note, let's say the above middle C, which sends out sound waves with a frequency of 440 Hz. If you mount the speaker on the hood of a car and have it driven toward you, the waves stack up on top of each other, making the interval between each of them shorter. When those compressed waves arrive in your eardrum, their perceived frequency is higher than 440 Hz. When the car backs up, the Doppler effect reverses and the perceived note drops below A. You can hear the Doppler effect at work every time an ambulance drives past you with blaring sirens. As it passes you by, the sound of its siren appears to slide down in pitch. The Doppler effect has proved to be a remarkably versatile concept. It has been used to detect the expansion of the universe, to track thunderstorms, and to perform ultrasounds. Because Sputnik was emitting a signal at a steady frequency, and because the microwave receiver was stationary, Geer and Weifenbach realized that they could calculate the movement of the satellite based on the small but steady changes in the waveform they were capturing. Late that night, they remembered an additional mathematical trick. By analyzing the slope of the Doppler shift, they could determine the point in Sputnik's orbit that was closest to the APL laboratories. Almost by accident, they had hit upon a technique not just for calculating the satellite's speed, but for actually mapping the trajectory of its orbit. In a matter of hours, the two young scientists had gone from listening to measuring to tracking the Russian satellite. Over the subsequent weeks, a loose network of scientists at AQUI coalesced around Gear and Weifenbach's hunch, filling in details, researching the theoretical literature on orbiting bodies, and proposing technology improvements. Eventually, the APL's director approved funds to run the numbers on the lab's new UNIVAC computer. Within a few months of that first transmission, they had a complete description of Sputnik's orbit, inferred entirely from that simple 20 MHz signal. Gear and Weifenbach had embarked on a quest that would define their professional careers, the adventure of their lives, as they later called it. In the spring of 1958, Frank T. McClure, the legendary deputy director of the Applied Physics Laboratory, called Gear and Weifenbach into his office. McClure had a confidential question to ask the men: if you could use the known location of a receiver on the ground to calculate the location of a satellite. McClure asked, could you reverse the problem? Could you calculate the location of a receiver on the ground if you knew the exact orbit of the satellite? Gear and Weifenbach ran the logic through their heads for a few minutes, and then answered in the affirmative. In fact, deducing the location from a known orbit, instead of a stationary ground position, would make the results significantly more accurate. Without explaining his ultimate interest in the question, McClure told the two men to run a quick feasibility analysis. After a few furious days of crunching the numbers, Gear and Weifenbach reported back. The inverse problem, as they called it, was eminently solvable. Soon, Gear and Weifenbach would learn why the inverse problem was so important to McClure. The military was developing its Polaris nuclear missiles, designed to be launched from submarines. Calculating accurate trajectories for a missile attack required precise knowledge of the launch site's location. This was easy enough to determine on land, say, for a missile silo in Alaska, but it was fiendishly difficult in the case of a submarine floating somewhere in the Pacific Ocean. McClure's idea was to take the ingenious Sputnik solution and flip it on its head. The military would establish the unknown location of its submarines by tracking the known location of satellites orbiting above the Earth. Just as sailors had used the stars to navigate for thousands of years, the military would steer its ships using the artificial stars of satellite technology. The project was dubbed the Transit System. Just 3 years after Sputnik's launch, there were 5 U.S. satellites in orbit, providing navigational data to the military. When Korean Airlines Flight 7 was shot down in 1983 after drifting into Soviet airspace thanks to faulty ground-based navigation beacons, Ronald Reagan declared that satellite-based navigation should be a common good open to civilian use. Around that time, the system took on its current name, Global Positioning System, or GPS. Half a century later, roughly 30 GPS satellites blanket the Earth with navigational signals, providing guidance for everything from mobile phones to digital cameras to Airbus A380s. If you wish to see firsthand the unpredictable power of an emergent platform, you need only look at what has happened to GPS over the past 5 years. The engineers that built the system, starting with Gear and Weifenbach, created an entire ecosystem of unexpected utility. Frank McClure recognized that you could harness Gear and Weifenbach's original insight to track nuclear submarines, but he had no inkling that 50 years later the same system would help teenagers to play elaborate games in urban centers, or climbers to explore treacherous mountain ranges, or photographers to upload their photos to Flickr maps. Like the internet itself, GPS has turned out to have immense commercial value, and many for-profit firms were involved in building out the infrastructure that made it a reality. But the ideas at the foundation of GPS, the notion of a satellite itself, the atomic clocks satellites rely on for accurate timing, and, of course, Gear and Weifenbach's original insight with Sputnik, all came out of the public sector. The generative nature of the GPS platform nicely mirrors the original environment that gave birth to it. When Gear and Weifenbach were asked to explain how they had hit upon their Sputnik revelation, they credited the intellectual habitat of the Applied Physics Lab more than their own particular talents. APL was a superb environment for inquisitive young kids, and particularly so in the research center. It was an environment that encouraged people to think broadly and generally about task problems, and one in which inquisitive kids felt free to follow their curiosity. Equally important, it was an environment wherein kids, with an initial success, could turn to colleagues who were broadly expert in relevant fields, and particularly because of the genius of the laboratory directorship, colleagues who were also knowledgeable about hardware, weapons, and weapons needs. In its own small way, the APL was a platform that encouraged and amplified hunches, that allowed those hunches to be connected with other minds that had relevant expertise. Out of that dense network, one of the most generative technological platforms of the 21st century took root. The APL was not a purely open platform, of course. There were military secrets involved. After all, And even if Gear and Weifenbach had wanted to share their Sputnik discovery with the world, it was much harder to distribute that breakthrough in an age when the hot new computer, the UNIVAC, took up an entire room. But behind those closed doors, William Gear and George Weifenbach were the beneficiaries of an environment that encouraged the chance collisions between different fields, an environment that let two kids stumble across an idea at the cafeteria and build an entire career around it. Most hotbeds of innovation have similar physical spaces associated with them. The Homebrew Computing Club in Silicon Valley, Freud's Wednesday Salon at 19 Burgas, the 18th century English coffee house. All these spaces were, in their own smaller-scale fashion, emergent platforms. Coffeehouse proprietors like Edward Lloyd or William Unwin were not trying to invent the modern publishing industry or the insurance business. They weren't at all interested in fostering scientific advancement or political turmoil. They were just businessmen, trying to make enough sterling to feed their families, just like those beavers constructing lodges to keep their offspring safe. But the spaces Lloyd and Unwin built turned out to have these unusual properties. They made people think differently, because they created an environment where different kinds of thoughts could productively collide and recombine. The most generative platforms come in stacks, most conspicuously in the layered platform of the web. The web can be imagined as a kind of archaeological site, with layers upon layers of platforms buried beneath every page. Tim Berners-Lee was able to single-handedly design a new medium because he could freely build on top of the open protocols of the Internet platform. He didn't have to engineer an entire system for communicating between computers spread across the planet. That problem had been solved decades before. All he had to do was build a standard framework for describing hypertext pages and sharing them via existing Internet channels. Even HTML was based on another existing platform, SGML, which had been developed at IBM in the 1960s. 14 years later, when Hurley, Chen, and Karam sat down to create YouTube, they built the service by stitching together elements from 3 different platforms. The web itself, of course, but also Adobe's Flash platform, which handled all the video playback, and the programming language JavaScript, which allowed end users to embed video clips on their own sites. Their ability to build on top of these existing platforms explains why 3 guys could build YouTube in 6 months, while an army of expert committees and electronics companies took 20 years to make HDTV a reality. Culture, too, relies on stacked platforms of information. Kuhn's paradigms of research are the scientific world's equivalent of a software platform, a set of rules and conventions that govern the definition of terms, the collection of data, and the boundaries of inquiry for a particular field. Kuhn's argument has often been mistaken as a defense of a purely relativistic account of science, where empirical truth is always in quotation marks because paradigms replace each other over time. But modern scientific paradigms are rarely overthrown. Instead, they are built upon. They create a platform that supports new paradigms above them. Darwin's theory of natural selection was a dangerous idea, in Daniel Dennett's phrase, because it challenged biblical and human-centric accounts of life's history. But the true measure of its scientific power lies in how many new fields were stacked on top of it over the course of the 20th century. The Mendelian and population genetics that emerged from the modern synthesis. In the 1940s, the molecular genetics revolution triggered by Watson and Crick's discovery of DNA, newer fields like evolutionary psychology and evolutionary development. Often, new scientific fields form by propping themselves over multiple platforms. The field that ultimately explained Darwin's paradox, ecosystems ecology, stands on the shoulders of population genetics, systems theory, and biochemistry, among others. Even the creative arts evolve via stacked platforms. This may seem surprising, given how readily we draw upon the image of the private artistic genius, holed up in his study, conjuring a whole new world in his head from scratch. For understandable reasons, we like to talk about artistic innovations in terms of the way that they break the rules, open up new doors in the adjacent possible that lesser minds never even see. But genius requires genres. Flaubert and Joyce needed the genre of the Bildungsroman to contort and undermine in Sentimental Education and A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. Dylan needed the conventions of acoustic folk to electrify the world with Highway 61 Revisited. Genres supply a set of implicit rules that have enough coherence that traditionalists can safely play inside them, and more adventurous artists can confound our expectations by playing with them. Genres are the platforms and paradigms of the creative world. They are almost never willed into existence by a single pioneering work. Instead, they fade into view through a complicated set of shared signals passed between artists, each contributing different elements to the mix. The murder mystery has been coherent as a novelistic genre for 100 years, but when you actually chart its pedigree, it gets difficult to point to a single donor. It's a little Poe, a little Dickens, a little Wilkie Collins, not to mention the dozens of contemporaries who didn't make the canon, but who nonetheless played a role in stabilizing the conventions of the genre. The same is true of Cubism, the sitcom, romantic poetry, jazz, magical realism, cinema verite, adventure novels, reality TV, and just about any artistic genre or mode that has ever mattered. The creative stack is deeper than genres, though. Genres are themselves built on top of more stable conventions and technologies. When Miles Davis announced his break with the chord and improv conventions of bebop jazz in So What?, the opening track of Kind of Blue, he was nonetheless working within the conventions of the D-Dorian scale the song employs, a mode that, as its name suggests, dates back to the Dorian Greeks. And of course, Davis built his new sound out of the older, stable platforms of the instruments themselves, starting with the valve trumpet that Davis played. Natural trumpets, lacking the complex valves that allow the trumpeter to switch keys on the fly, are almost as old as the Dorian mode. The modern valve trump that Davis played emerged as a standard in the 19th century, after decades of tinkering by instrument makers across Europe. Davis could afford to explore the adjacent possible of jazz to help invent a whole new genre that others would build upon, in part because he didn't have to invent the D-Dorian or the valve trumpet. In the online world, the most celebrated recent case study in the innovative power of stacked platforms has been the rapid evolution of the social networking service Twitter. Twitter's creators, Jack Dorsey, Evan Williams, and Biz Stone, benefited from existing platforms just as the YouTube founders did. Twitter's legendary 140-character limit is based on the limitations of the SMS mobile communications platform that they rely on to connect web messages to mobile phones. But the most fascinating thing about Twitter is how much has been built on top of its platform in 3 short years. When it first emerged, Twitter was widely derided as a frivolous distraction that was mostly good for telling your friends what you had for breakfast. Now it is being used to organize and share news about the Iranian political protests, to route around government censorship, to provide customer support for large corporations, to share interesting news items, and 1,000 other applications that did not occur to the founders when they dreamed up the service in 2006. This is not just a case of cultural exaptation, people finding a new use for a tool designed to do something else. In Twitter's case, the users have been redesigning the tool itself. The convention of replying to another user with the @ symbol was spontaneously invented by the Twitter user base. Early Twitter users ported over a convention from the IRC messaging platform and began grouping a topic or event by the hashtag, as in #30rock or #inauguration. The ability to search a live stream of tweets, which is likely to prove crucial to Twitter's ultimate business model, thanks to its advertising potential, was developed by another startup altogether. Thanks to these innovations, following a live feed of tweets about an event, political debates, or lost episodes has become a central part of the Twitter experience. But for the first year of Twitter's existence, that mode of interaction would have been technically impossible using Twitter. It's like inventing a toaster oven and then looking around a year later and discovering that all your customers have, on their own, figured out a way to turn it into a microwave. One of the most telling facts about the Twitter platform is that the vast majority of its users interact with the service via software that has been created by third parties. There are hundreds of iPhone and BlackBerry applications that let you manage your Twitter feeds, all created by enterprising amateur coders or small startups. There are services that help you upload photos and link to them from your tweets, programs that map other Twitizens who are near you geographically. Ironically, the tools are offered if you visit the twitter.com site have changed very little in the past 2 years. But there's an entire Home Depot of Twitter tools available everywhere else. The diversity of the Twitter platform is no accident. It derives from a deliberate strategy that Dorsey, Williams, and Stone embraced from the outset. They built an emergent platform first, and then they built Twitter.com. An open platform in software is often called an API, which stands for Application Programming Interface. An API is a kind of lingua franca that software applications can use reliably to communicate with each other, a set of standardized rules and definitions that allow programmers to build new tools on top of another platform, or to weave together information from multiple platforms. When web users make geographic mashups using Google Maps, they write programs that communicate with Google's geographic data using their mapping API. Some APIs reveal only a small subset of a platform's underlying code, in part for simplicity's sake, but also for proprietary reasons. Conventionally, a developer will create a piece of software and once it's finished, expose a small part of its functionality to outside developers via the API. The Twitter team took the exact opposite approach. They built the API first and exposed all the data that was crucial to the service, and then they built Twitter.com on top of the API. Conventional software assumes that API users are second-class citizens who shouldn't get full access to the software's secret sauce for fear of losing competitive advantage. Twitter's creators recognized that there was another kind of competitive advantage that came from complete openness, the advantage that comes from having the largest and most diverse ecosystem of software applications being built on your platform. Call it cooperative advantage. The burden of coming up with good ideas for the product is no longer shouldered exclusively by the company itself. On an open platform, good ideas can come from anywhere. The way for-profit companies like Twitter and Google have used open APIs to spur innovation has been fascinating to watch. But the more intriguing developments lie in the public sector. In the fall of 2008, Vivek Kundra, Chief Technology Officer for the District of Columbia, announced a program called Apps for Democracy. Software developers were invited to build applications that drew upon the open data made available by the city government. The applications could take just about any form imaginable: websites, Facebook applications, iPhone apps, as long as they attempted to make some part of the government data trove more useful for residents, visitors, businesses, or government agencies. The winners would receive $10,000 in prize money. The city provided just 30 days for developers to create their applications. But even in that narrow window, 47 different applications were submitted. The two winning applications showcased historic walking tours around the D.C. area and provided extensive demographic information for residents thinking of moving to a new neighborhood. Other submissions included tools for tracking government spending on specific projects, guides for city bikers, and real-time parking information with data received directly from on-street parking meters. One ingenious and amusing app called Stumble Safely helped inebriated users to plot the safest pedestrian route home from any bar in the city. The DC experiment was such a success that versions of it are currently proliferating in dozens of major cities around the world. When DC launched its second iteration of Apps for Democracy in the spring of 2009, Kundra wasn't around to award the prizes, but for a good reason. He had been appointed the nation's chief information officer by President Obama, helping to create the ambitious Data.gov program, along with an Apps for America contest run by the Sunlight Foundation. What these initiatives share is a willingness to learn from the innovation platforms of Twitter, Google, and Facebook. When Al Gore set about to reinvent government during the Clinton administration, one of that project's ambitious goals was to make the bureaucracy more innovative. But Gore's solutions were, almost without exception, inward-facing, creating new organizational structures inside the government, cutting down on red tape, encouraging cross-departmental collaboration. What Apps for Democracy suggests is a more open-ended idea. Some of the best ideas for government are likely to come from outside the government. If the outside developer community could build something as essential to Twitter's business as a search interface, then why can't citizen developers provide comparable innovations for their government? Surely someone out there can come up with a better user experience for filing tax forms. Government bureaucracies have a long and richly deserved reputation for squelching innovation, but they possess 4 key elements that may allow them to benefit from the innovation engine of an emergent platform. First, they are repositories of a vast amount of information and services that could be of potential value to ordinary people if only we could organize it all better. Second, ordinary people have a passionate interest in the kind of information governments deal with, whether it's data about industrial zoning, healthcare services, or crime rates. Third, a long tradition exists of citizens committing time and intellectual energy to tackling problems where there is a perceived civic good at stake. And, finally, the fact that governments are not in the private sector means that they do not feel any competitive pressure to keep their data proprietary. Since the supernova that was the Howard Dean campaign in 2004, it has been clear that network technology can be harnessed to help our leaders run for office. But we have not yet seen real evidence that these extraordinary technologies can help those leaders govern more effectively once they get elected. But thinking of government as a platform, to borrow a phrase from web visionary Tim O'Reilly, might be one way to carry out the promise of digital age governance. Political leadership involves some elements that aren't best outsourced to a liquid network: decision-making and oratory. But a good government is, at least in part, a government that comes up with innovative solutions to the problems of its citizens, or to the problems faced by bureaucracy itself. That's where the platform model can do its magic. Part of that magic is economic. Emergent platforms can dramatically reduce the costs of creation. Those 47 apps generated in a month by the original Apps for Democracy contest had a total cost to the DC government of $50,000. Underestimated that. Had the city government contracted out for those applications using its traditional methods, the cost to the city would have been more than $2 million. The same math applies to private sector web innovation. If Hurley, Chen, and Karim had been forced to concoct an online video standard from scratch, it would have taken years and tens of millions of dollars just to get a working beta version online. To this day, Twitter has not spent a dime building a mapping application to track the location of tweets, because dozens of services exist that do exactly that, created and promoted by third parties at zero cost to Twitter itself. Though they are not measured in monetary units, natural platforms display similar patterns of economic efficiency. Pileated woodpeckers make their homes by drilling large holes in dead trees. But woodpeckers don't have the resources to kill off trees on their own, so they're largely dependent on stumbling across trees that have died of natural causes. But in creating their forest wetlands, beavers are constantly toppling trees, and so pileated woodpeckers flourish in the engineered ecosystem created by the beavers. They get the benefit of the softer, more pliable wood of a rotting tree without the cost of having to fell the tree. Interestingly, woodpeckers generally abandon the homes they've carved into the tree after a year, making them ideal spaces for songbirds to nest. The songbirds benefit from the cavities created by the woodpeckers without being burdened by the costs of drilling through all that wood. The wetland created by the beaver, like the thriving platform created by the Twitter founders, invites variation because it is an open platform where resources are shared as much as they are protected. If you sail due east 16 nautical miles from Delaware's Indian River Inlet and dive 80 feet down into the open waters of the Atlantic Ocean, you will discover an underwater city thriving on the seafloor, massive schools of flounder, sea bass, and tautog darting through gently waving sea grasses. You will also find roughly 700 subway cars, deposited there by the Delaware Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Control over the past decade. The trains have been planted off the Delaware shore to create an artificial reef, providing a durable shelter for mussels and sponges that are otherwise challenged by the sandy floors of the northeast seaboard. Artificial reefs create significant breeding grounds for a diverse group of fish. The Delaware reefs have seen a 400% increase in biomass since the first cars were sunk. No longer needed for mass transportation, the abandoned subway cars have taken on a new occupation in their retirement years. They are now ecosystem engineers. Platforms have a natural appetite for trash, waste, and abandoned goods. The sea bass and mussels making a home in a decommissioned train, like the songbirds nesting in the abandoned homes of the pileated woodpeckers, mirror a pattern Jane Jacobs detected years ago in urban development. Innovation thrives in discarded spaces. Emergent platforms derive much of their creativity from the inventive and economical reuse of existing resources. And, as any urbanite will tell you, the most expensive resource in a big city is real estate. If you look about, you will see that only operations that are well established, high turnover, standardized, or heavily subsidized can afford, commonly, to carry the costs of new construction, Jacobs wrote. Chain stores, chain restaurants, and banks go into new construction. But neighborhood bars, foreign restaurants, and pawn shops go into older buildings. Supermarkets and shoe stores often go into new buildings. Good bookstores and antiques dealers seldom do. One implication of this is that riskier or smaller scale enterprises tend to have difficulty getting traction in planned environments that lack the economic wear and tear of the traditional urban fabric, where buildings, blocks, and whole neighborhoods lose their original inhabitants and industries, sometimes to catastrophic effects. The shopping mall is only 50 years old, and so is relatively young by the millennial scale of some cities. But thus far, even the most down on its luck mall has retained its original function, as a place where consumers gather to buy things for personal use. They have not yet been reclaimed by troops of performance artists, or internet startups, or heavy industry. There are streets in the West Village of Manhattan, where Jacobs lived for so many years, that now resemble shopping malls. But over the past 2 centuries, those old buildings have hosted an entire cavalcade of different uses. They have served as the hub of an industrial port, as the primary supply point of meat for a city of 8 million people, as a refuge for beatniks and dropouts, as the epicenter of the gay rights movement. Jacobs's point was that the frenetic energy of a large city, the urban version of creative destruction, creates a natural supply of older, less desirable environments that can be imaginatively reoccupied by the small or the eccentric, the subcultures that Fisher found so essential to urban life. Artists, poets, and entrepreneurs are the vibrant fish swimming among the coral of the Keeling Islands. They find it easier to live in an exoskeleton that has long since been abandoned by its original host. As Jacobs observed, as for really new ideas of any kind, no matter how ultimately profitable or otherwise successful some of them might prove to be, there is no leeway for such chancy trial, error, and experimentation in the high overhead economy of new construction. Old ideas can sometimes use new buildings. New ideas must use old buildings. Platforms recycle much more than just architecture. Marine ecologists who have studied the flow of energy through coral reef ecosystems have found that coral reefs do an astounding job of recycling nutrients. Scientists have long recognized the importance of the symbiotic relationship between the coral and a microscopic algae called zooxanthella. The two organisms effectively rely on each other's waste products. The algae captures energy from the sun and outputs oxygen and sugars as waste, which the coral polyps use to power their own growth. At the same time, the corals expel carbon dioxide, nitrates, and phosphates as waste, each of which fuels the growth of zooxanthellae. As the population of zooxanthellae expands, more solar energy is captured and thus available to be shared with the broader ecosystem of the reef. The zooxanthella and the coral are like two neighbors who miraculously turn out to have a pressing need for each other's garbage, and thus meet every night to swap trash cans. But the nutrient recycling of a coral reef extends far beyond the collaboration between coral and zooxanthella. In 2001, a team of German ecologists led by Claudio Richter used endoscopes to examine the tiny internal cavities of coral reefs in the Red Sea. Hidden in those diminutive grottos was a vast population of sponges that have adapted to the dark interior of the coral reef because it provides them sanctuary from their natural predators, sea urchins, and parrotfish. The sponges consume another key photosynthetic organism, phytoplankton, as it drifts through the aragonite caves of the reef. Like the zooxanthellae, the sponges then expel waste products that the coral can use as nutrients. Those long-hidden sponges embody two principles of platform recycling. By co-opting the abandoned space of the coral skeleton, they reduce the costs of fortifying themselves against predators. And in return, they expel nutrients that allow their host to excrete even more aragonite, creating new habitats for more sponges. The entire coral reef ecosystem is characterized by similarly intricate and interdependent food webs, the full complexity of which scientists are only now beginning to map. Once you understand the way biological platforms build on the waste products generated within the system, Darwin's paradox ceases to be a paradox at all. The symbiotic relationship between coral and zooxanthella increases the total energy captured from the sun, and the tight nutrient cycles created by the productive reuse of energy sources by so many densely interconnected species means that the habitat can do much more with less. You get a watery metropolis with astonishing diversity in an environment that by rights should be as desolate as the sandy atoll above sea level. It is not competition that drives that process, but rather the inventive collaborations of density. The reef platform does not have the luxurious supply of nutrients that tidal estuaries do, delivered daily by the freshwater rivers that carve topsoil out of riverbanks upstream. But the reef platform thrives nonetheless, thanks to the ecosystem engineering of the coral, and the marvelous recycling of both shelter and biological waste that makes the platform so vital. 5 above the waterline, on those vacant atolls, a markedly different landscape appears, much closer to the wasteful ecosystems of deserts. Most of the solar energy that saturates desert environments gets lost, assimilated only by the few succulents that can survive in such a hostile climate. Those plants pass along enough energy to sustain a limited number of insects, which in turn supply food for the occasional reptile or bird, all of which ultimately feeds the bacteria. But most of the energy never gets put to use by organic life. If Brent Constance has his way, the coral reef's genius for recycling and platform building will end up transforming the physical platforms of human settlements. In the late 70s, while pursuing a Darwin-esque double major in biology and geology at the University of California, Santa Barbara, Constance became fascinated by the coral polyp's extraordinary powers of biomineralization, its ability to build an immense structure of calcium carbonate durable enough to last for millions of years. Human beings may be justifiably proud of venerable engineering achievements like the pyramids or the Great Wall of China, but those monuments pale in comparison to the Great Barrier Reef, the largest biological structure on the planet. As an undergrad, Constance daydreamed about harnessing the coral's engineering skills to create entire buildings out of prefab templates. Instead of pouring concrete or attaching steel beams, the templates would simply be lowered into seawater, where the reef building process would magically conjure up a building. It was a fantasy in those years, but Constance kept that strange vision in the back of his mind for decades. By 1985, Constance was most of the way through a PhD at UC Santa Cruz and had become an expert in the techniques of biomineralization. On his way to a research expedition funded by an NSF grant, he stopped over for a few days to see his parents at their home near Palo Alto. Watching a football game with his father, a physician, he picked up a medical journal and stumbled across an article about the massive health expenses associated with osteoporosis, a disease that disrupts bone mineral density, causing painful and debilitating fractures. A few weeks later, he was standing on the Rangiroa Atoll in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, measuring the speed with which the corals built their skeletons, and his mind flashed back to the osteoporosis article. If you could somehow capture these skeleton growth processes, he thought, you could really help all those old ladies with broken hips. 2 years later, he started his first company, which mimicked the coral's growth mechanism to create bone cement to repair fractures. Today, the cements that Constance created are employed in most orthopedic operating rooms throughout the United States and Europe. Constance went on to found 2 other successful biomedical companies, but that original hunch about building physical infrastructure out of coral skeletons lingered in the back of his mind. While teaching at Stanford in the mid-2000s, he joined the cross-disciplinary faculty of the Woods Institute for the Environment, where for the first time he learned about the mammoth environmental impact of manufacturing Portland cement, the third largest source of human-created carbon dioxide emissions on the planet. In his mind, a new network of ideas began to take shape, reviving his old undergraduate dream of growing aquatic cities. Coral reefs created cement-like structures without polluting the environment, and Constance had 3 successful companies to show that mimicking the coral growth mechanics could create useful new materials. What if you took those mechanics and used them for building highway overpasses instead of repairing hip fractures? The slow hunch he had been nurturing for 25 years had finally found the right connection. He took his vision of a green cement to one of Silicon Valley's legendary venture capitalists, Vinod Khosla, who agreed to fund the company without seeing so much as a business plan or PowerPoint deck. Constance built a laboratory in Los Gatos, where they began growing carbonate cement in transport trailers filled with seawater. He soon discovered that the system generated 8 times as much cement if you pumped the water full of carbon dioxide, like some oversized, salty club soda. One day, when Khosla came to inspect the lab, Constance turned to his investor and asked, "Where can we get large quantities of carbon dioxide?" Khosla looked at him in disbelief. As one of the world's most prominent clean tech investors, Khosla was well aware that the planet was teeming with industrial plants who were desperately trying to find a place to put their carbon dioxide. Entire markets were emerging around technologies of carbon sequestration, locking up CO2 by injecting it into oil and gas reserves, or burying it deep in the ocean. But Constance had stumbled across a much more powerful idea. You didn't have to bury all that CO2. You could use it to build stuff. The Calera story is still very much in progress. It remains an open question whether the cities of our future will be built underwater by virtual coral reefs on a diet of factory exhaust. It sounds fanciful when described that way, of course, but no more fanciful than the idea of the Great Barrier Reef would have seemed a billion years ago. Nature has long built its platforms by recycling the available resources, including the waste generated by other organisms. 2 things we have in abundance on this planet right now are pollution and seawaste. Why not try to build a city out of them? The stacked platform of the web depends on recycling as well. The word ecosystem has become a fashionable term to describe the diverse collection of sites and services associated with Web 2.0. Like most jargon, the metaphor points to an important truth if you think of the flows of information across the web as being analogous to the flows of energy through a natural ecosystem. But also like most jargon, the metaphor is too general, and its broad scope actually makes it harder for us to see the most important thing about the evolution of the web over the past 15 years. The web is not simply an ecosystem, it is a specific type of ecosystem. It started as a desert, and it has been steadily transforming into a coral reef. Part of the beauty and power of Tim Berners-Lee's architecture for the web lies in its simplicity. Websites were made up of hypertext pages that could connect to other information on the web through one primary conduit, the link. Imagine it's 1995, and you decide to post a short review of a new restaurant in Boston's Back Bay neighborhood on your home page, as we used to call them back then. In posting that restaurant review, you are contributing new information to the web's ecosystem. Like zooxanthellae capturing energy from the sun, You are taking information originally created outside the environment and adding it to the information resources available on the web. The question is, what happened to that information once you added it to the system? You could link to the home page of the restaurant itself, if you were lucky enough to find one in those early days. From that point on, your site would be connected to that other page, and subsequent visitors to your site could follow that connection with a single mouse click. In some basic sense, by linking to the original restaurant site, you would be recycling the information stored there, making your review more informative. Another food lover might stumble across your review and link to it from her own site, or forward the URL for your review in an email message to a few friends. But for the most part, the information added to the system would remain trapped on your original page, like a lonely cactus waiting for a handful of insects to stumble across it. Fast forward to the present. You're sitting in the same restaurant, having just finished a delightful bowl of vichyssoise, and you pull out your mobile phone and compose a 140-character rave review of the soup, with a link to the restaurant's website, and you post it to Twitter before the check has even arrived. Just as before, you are adding new information to the web's ecosystem with that tweet. But what happens to that information after you press submit on your phone? For starters, it circulates through the ecosystem in a way that was unthinkable in 1995. Within seconds of your composing the note, it is pushed out to all your Twitter followers, in some cases sent directly to their mobile phones. Thanks to the retweeting convention spontaneously adopted by the Twitter community, that original vichyssoise tweet is easily forwarded along to other foodies on Twitter. But that's just the start of the journey. Thanks to the geographic data attached to the post by your GPS-powered mobile device, the real-world social network, Foursquare automatically distributes the vichyssoise tweet to all its users who have recently visited nearby bars, restaurants, or other public spaces. The tweet pops up immediately as a pushpin on the countless Twitter maps that developers have created over the past few years. The hyperlocal news platform outside parses the geodata and detects the name of the restaurant in the tweet, and automatically attaches it to pages devoted to discussion of the restaurant itself, along with pages that cover all the news and commentary about the Back Bay neighborhood, and pages devoted to the Boston restaurant scene. A Boston newspaper that has built neighborhood-specific news pages using Outside and's open publisher platform runs that tweet on a page devoted to food gossip in the Back Bay. Google detects the link to the restaurant's website and registers the link as a vote endorsing the quality of that page, which causes it to rise higher in the search results page when people query Google with its name. The tweet even shows up in the inbox of the restaurant's proprietor, who has established a Google alert that automatically emails him when anything appears online that mentions his restaurant by name. On many of these pages, on the newspaper sites, on Google, local ads appear for other businesses in the neighborhood, drawn like moths to the bright flame of the geographic data embedded in the tweet. Most of that whole sequence unfolds within minutes, without you having to think about anything other than composing those 140 characters and remembering to press submit. The story here is not the old chestnut of living in a connected age where information flows more quickly than ever before. The information is not simply flowing in this system. It's being recycled and put to new uses, transformed by a diverse network of other species in the ecosystem, each with its own distinct function. You write a tweet about what you had for lunch, the original sin of Twitter banality, and within minutes that information is being harnessed to assist a staggering number of different tasks. Neighbors forging new personal connections, foodies seeking a delicious cup of potato and leek soup, restaurant owners getting unvarnished feedback from their patrons, Google organizing all the world's information, newspapers improving their neighborhood coverage at lower cost, and local businesses seeking the attention of the people in their immediate community. Not bad for 140 characters. But of course the point is that those 140 characters had help. At every step of their journey, they were standing on layers of stacked platforms. The simplicity of sending out a message to a social network of followers depends on the Twitter API and underlying database. That they instantly reach mobile phones as text messages relies on the SMS communications protocol. Outside.in distributes its neighborhood data using the open RSS platform. The geodata embedded in the original tweet relies on the adapted military intelligence technology of GPS. The Twitter maps all involve API calls to Google's map service. And, of course, the entire operation is sustained by the Coral and Zooxanthellae foundation of underlying protocols like HTTP and TCP/IP. All those services and standards were essential to the web of information that benefited from those 140 characters, but not one of them required a business development deal, or a licensing fee, or even an old-fashioned handshake. You can build on all of them without asking for permission. And when you don't have to ask for permission, innovation thrives. When Gear, Weifenbach, and McClure were designing their system to help American submarines launch Polaris missiles against the Soviet Union, it never occurred to them that someday someone would use their platform to rave about a bowl of potato and leek soup to nearby strangers. Stacked platforms are like that. You think you're fighting the Cold War, and it turns out you're actually helping people figure out where to have lunch. In a funny way, the real benefit of stacked platforms lies in the knowledge you no longer need to have. You don't need to know how to send signals to satellites or parse geodata to send that tweet circulating through the web's ecosystem. Miles Davis didn't have to build a valve trumpet or invent the D-Dorian mode to record Kind of Blue. The songbird sitting in an abandoned woodpecker's nest doesn't need to know how to drill a hole into the side of a poplar, or how to fell a 100-foot tree. That is the generative power of open platforms. The songbird doesn't carry the cost of drilling and felling because the knowledge of how to do those things was openly supplied by other species in the chain. She just needs to know how to tweet. Conclusion. The fourth quadrant. On the somewhat desolate corner of Grand Street and Morgan Avenue in the Williamsburg neighborhood of Brooklyn, a 5-story building stands, built in the watered-down Romanesque style favored by industrial architects a century ago. Today it is home to a mix of uses, 20-something roommates sharing loft spaces on the fringes of one of New York's hottest neighborhoods, amid a handful of small businesses, most of them in the information industries. 100 years ago, the building had a single tenant, the Sackett-Wilhelm Lithography Company. If you stand at the front door on Grand Street, or scan the bars on the first-floor windows and the graffiti on the old loading docks, nothing indicates the historic nature of the site. But historic it is. The Sackett-Wilhelm Lithography Company housed the first working version of a machine that would do more to transform the settlement patterns of human beings than any other 20th century invention, with the possible exception of the automobile. In 1902, the Sackett-Wilhelm Company had a profitable and growing business printing color publications, like the popular humor magazine Judge. But they faced one vexing problem: the air. Small changes in humidity could complicate the printing process on multiple levels. The paper would expand as it absorbed water molecules floating in the factory air, ink would flow at different rates, and dry more slowly. Unusually humid days could slow the entire production down dramatically, making it difficult for the Sackett-Wilhelm executives to promise reliable delivery times to its clients. Human beings had been artificially moderating air temperature since the invention of fire. The 19th century had witnessed a growing trend toward mechanical heating systems. A few exotic schemes had attempted to cool building interiors, but all of them involved drawing air over massive quantities of ice. Madison Square Theater in Manhattan used 4 tons of ice each night to make summertime evenings tolerable for their patrons, but none of these approaches tackled the problem of humidity. After 2 consecutive heat waves in the summers of 1900 and 1901, the Sackett-Wilhelm owners contacted the New York office of the Buffalo Forge Company, which specialized in mechanical heating systems for large industry. They were the experts in making the air warmer. Could they make it less wet? It was a fortuitous query, because the founder of the Buffalo Forge Company, William F. Wendt, had just caved into the demands of an ambitious 25-year-old electrical engineer named Willis Carrier and created a research program where Carrier could take on more speculative projects. Carrier's lab was the perfect place to tackle a problem like dehumidifying air, and Carrier threw himself into the project with enthusiasm. After experimenting with a handful of failed schemes suggested by his colleagues, Carrier followed his own instincts and built a contraption that passed chilled water through a heating coil that usually conveyed steam. Using dew point charts from the Weather Bureau, he built a system that cooled the air to the dew point temperature that would produce the 55% humidity that the Sackett-Wilhelm Company considered optimal. By the late summer of 1902, a system engineered by Carrier was operational in the Sackett-Wilhelm plant. It drew water from an artesian well, with additional cooling provided by an ammonia refrigerating machine. The overall cooling effect on a hot summer day was the equivalent of melting 108,000 pounds of ice in a single 24-hour period. Carrier would continue tinkering with his system over the following years. The Sackett-Wilhelm system had been a success, but the steel coils were prone to rust after regular use. One night, waiting for a train in Philadelphia, watching a heavy fog roll across the platform, he had a sudden flash of insight. His air conditioning system could be a miniature fog machine. By drawing air across a fine spray of water inside the device, he could use the water itself as a condensing surface. Thanks to those tenacious hydrogen bonds, the molecules of water vapor in the spray would pull the moisture out of the air, regulating the humidity and eliminating the rust problem. Carrier applied for a patent for his apparatus for treating air in September of 1904. On the second day of 1906, the patent was granted. Before long, Carrier and a band of entrepreneurial engineers from Buffalo Forge broke off and formed the Carrier Engineering Corporation, devoted exclusively to the manufacture of air conditioning systems. The business made Carrier a wealthy man, as air conditioning went from a curiosity to a luxury item to a middle-class necessity. In 2007, the Carrier Corporation, now part of United Technologies, did $15 billion in sales. Thanks to Carrier's brilliant idea, the second half of the 20th century saw a mass migration within the United States to the Sunbelt and to deep south climates that had been nearly intolerable before the widespread adoption of air conditioning. It is not exaggerating matters to say that Carrier's idea ultimately rearranged the social and political map of America. Carrier's story is the archetypal myth of modern innovation. A clever individual, working in a private research lab, driven by ambition and the promise of great riches, hits upon a brilliant idea in a sudden flash of insight and the world changes. Yes, Carrier's story is slightly more complicated than this cartoon version suggests. He was more focused originally on humidity than on temperature. The ultimate solution took several years to crystallize, and some of his technical solutions built on the ideas of those who had come before him. But this is quibbling. Carrier's narrative fits the classic mold of the genius entrepreneur. It lacks almost all of the patterns that we have seen over the preceding chapters: no liquid networks, no coffeehouse exaptations, no brilliant mistakes. And it ends with a triumphant patent grant. All of which leads to the inevitable question, is Willis Carrier an anomaly or not? The question has real political and social stakes, because the doxa of market capitalism as an unparalleled innovation engine has long leaned on stories like Willis Carrier's miraculous cooling device as a cornerstone of its faith. 6. In many respects, these beliefs made sense, because the implicit alternatives were the planned economies of socialism and communism. State-run economies were fundamentally hierarchies, not networks. They consolidated decision-making power in a top-down command system, which meant that new ideas had to be approved by the authorities before they could begin to spread through the society. Markets, by contrast, allowed good ideas to erupt anywhere in the system. In modern tech speak, markets allowed innovation to flourish at the edges of the network. Planned economies were more like the old mainframe computer systems that predated the internet, where every participant had to get authorization from a central machine to do new work. When Friedrich von Hayek launched his influential argument in the 1940s about the importance of price signals in market economies, he was observing a related phenomenon. The decentralized pricing mechanism of the marketplace allows an entrepreneur to gauge the relative value of his or her innovation. If you come up with an interesting new contraption, you don't need to persuade a government commission of its value. You just need to get someone to buy it. Entire institutions and legal frameworks, not to mention a vast tower of conventional wisdom, have been built around the Carrier model of innovation. But what if he's the exception and not the rule? There are 3 main approaches for settling a question as complicated as this. You can dive deeply into a single story and try to persuade your audience that it is representative of a larger societal truth. The advantage of this approach is that it allows you to examine a case study in exhaustive detail. The disadvantage, of course, is that your audience has to take it on faith that the case study you've chosen is indeed representative of a wider truth. The second approach, which I have taken in the preceding chapters of this book, is to build an argument around dozens of anecdotes drawn from different contexts and historical periods. The anecdotal approach sacrifices detail for breadth. Yet it, too, runs the risk of being accused of cherry-picking. If there are 100 Willis Carriers for every Tim Berners-Lee, it doesn't really prove anything to string together a book of Berners-Lee stories. To see around the potential distortions of the case study and anecdotal approaches, you need to see the entire field of innovation through a single lens. You can't tell whether Willis Carrier is an anomaly by studying the fine points of his biography. You need a wider view. So let us perform an experiment on the data available on the history of innovation. Take roughly 200 of the most important innovations and scientific breakthroughs from the past 600 years, starting with Gutenberg's press, everything from Einstein's theory of relativity to the invention of air conditioning to the birth of the World Wide Web. Plot each breakthrough somewhere in one of the 4 quadrants of this diagram. Classify innovations that involved a small, coordinated team within an organization, or, even better, a single inventor as individual. Classify as networked all the innovations that evolved through collective, distributed processes, with a large number of groups working on the same problem. Inventors who plan to capitalize directly from the sale or licensing of their invention should be classified as market. Those who wished their ideas to flow freely into the infosphere belonged to the non-market side. The result is 4 quadrants, the first correlating to the private corporation or the solo entrepreneur, the second to a marketplace where multiple private firms interact, the third to the amateur scientist or hobbyist who shares his or her ideas freely, and finally, the 4th quadrant, which corresponds to open source or academic environments, where ideas can be built upon and reimagined in large, collaborative networks. By taking this long view, we can begin to answer the question we began with: just how dominant is the Willis-Carrier model of innovation? 7. Which quadrant has the most impressive track record for generating good ideas? To give us some bearings, our anchor tenant in the first quadrant, the market-based individual, is Carrier himself, who single-handedly drove the invention of air conditioning and who had clear commercial aspirations for his device. An example of a networked market innovation would be the vacuum tube, the creation of which involved a decentralized network with dozens of key participants, including Lee De Forest, almost all of whom worked either as patent-prone entrepreneurs or research scientists within larger corporations. Tim Berners-Lee's creation of the World Wide Web belongs to the individual, non-market quadrant, while the Internet itself belongs to the 4th quadrant, given the vast number of public sector individuals and organizations involved in its creation. It should be noted that these classifications do not reflect the cumulative nature of almost any innovation. Berners-Lee needed the open platform of the Internet for his hypertext creation to take flight, and thus the many individuals who built ARPANET and TCP/IP should be understood as essential contributors to the web. Had those platforms been more proprietary ones, say, by charging licensing fees for the privilege of developing on top of them, it's entirely possible that Berners-Lee wouldn't have bothered creating the web in the first place, given that it was a side project that his superiors knew next to nothing about. It is in the nature of good ideas to stand on the shoulders of the giants who came before them, which means that by some measure, every important innovation is fundamentally a network affair. But, for the sake of clarity, let's not blur the line between individual and network by admitting to the discussion the prior innovations that inspired or supported the new generation of ideas. Yes, it is important that Gutenberg borrowed the screw press technology from the winemakers, but one cannot say that the printing press was a collective innovation the way, for example, the Internet clearly was. So Gutenberg and Berners-Lee get classified on the individual side of the spectrum. There is no reliable mathematical formula for making these classifications, and to a certain extent each of them involves an element of subjectivity. But I think that, seen together as a group, they reveal an interesting pattern. Interesting enough, I would argue, for us to tolerate a little noise in the data. We are accustomed to looking at certain historical developments, mostly demographic, in this condensed, time-lapse format. We watch the growth of cities, or markets, or national populations unfold in charts where each tick measures a century. There are truths made visible by these time-lapse views that present-tense surveys or individual, narrative histories cannot properly shine light on. But we rarely measure cultural changes this way. So much of the history of ideas is like Darwin's work as a naturalist during the long years that preceded the publication of Origin, analyzing an individual species, defining its key characteristics, and putting it in the proper box. That's a fine approach for understanding why a specific idea came into being at a particular moment in time. But if you want to wrestle with the question one link farther up the chain, how do good ideas tend to come about, you need to take on the problem from a different angle. There's a place for counting barnacles. But sometimes you need to zoom out and take the longer view. In taking this approach, I am exapting a technique that the literary historian Franco Morti calls distant reading. In a series of influential books and essays published over the past decade, Morti has broken from the traditional English department approach of close reading, in which individual literary texts are analyzed in exhaustive detail. It doesn't really matter whether the close reading in question is an old-school tribute to an artist's singular talents or a politicized deconstruction. You can read the text closely to reveal the genius of the author, or his latent homophobia, but in each case you're doing close reading, where every sentence is a potential data point in your analysis. Distant reading takes the satellite view of the literary landscape, looking for larger patterns in the history of the stories we tell each other. In one typically inventive analysis, Morti tracked the evolution of subgenres in popular British novels from 1740 to 1950. An immense taxonomy of narrative forms, spy novels, picaresques, Gothic novels, nautical tales, mysteries, and dozens of other distinct forms. He plotted the lifespan of each subgenre as a dominant species in the British literary ecosystem. The result is on page 223. British novelistic genres. 1,740,109 Tisra. What happens when you take the distant approaching to reading novels is that you're able to see patterns that simply aren't visible on the scale of paragraphs and pages, or even entire books. You could read a dozen Silver Fork novels and Bildungsromans and yet miss the most striking fact revealed by Morty's chart, that the diversity of forms is strikingly balanced by their uncannily similar lifespans, which Morty attributes to underlying generational turnover. Every 25 to 30 years a new batch of genres becomes dominant, as a new generation of readers seeks out new literary conventions. If you're trying to understand the meaning of an individual work, you have to read closely. But if you're interested in the overall behavior of the literary system, its own patterns of innovation, sometimes you have to read from a long way off. In the study of scientific or technological innovation, the equivalent of close reading is the meticulous biography of the great inventor, or the history of a single technology, the radio, say, or the personal computer. As valuable as those approaches can be, they have their limitations. Close reading leaves you with the idiosyncrasies of each individual or invention, the local color, but not the general laws. When you view the history of innovation from a distance, what you lose in detail you gain in perspective. Classifying 200 good ideas into 4 broad quadrants certainly makes it harder to learn anything specific about each individual innovation. But it does allow us to answer the question we began with: what kind of environments make innovation possible in the first place? 14.0 to 16.0. Because innovation is subject to historical changes, many of which are themselves the result of influential innovations in the transmission of information, the 4 quadrants display distinct shapes at different historical periods. Start with this view of the breakthrough ideas from 14.0 to 16.0, beginning with Gutenberg's press and continuing on to the dawn of the Enlightenment. This is the shape that Renaissance innovation takes, seen from a great distance. Most innovation clusters in the 3rd quadrant, non-market individuals. A handful of outliers are scattered fairly evenly across the other 3 quadrants. This is the pattern that forms when information networks are slow and unreliable, and entrepreneurial economic conventions are poorly developed. It's too hard to share ideas when the printing press and the postal system are still novelties, and there's not enough incentive to commercialize those ideas without a robust marketplace of buyers and investors. And so the era is dominated by solo artists, amateur investigators, usually well-to-do, working on their own private obsessions. Not surprisingly, this period marks the birth of the modern notion of the inventive genius, the rogue visionary who somehow sees beyond the horizon that limits his contemporaries: Da Vinci, Copernicus, Galileo. Some of those solo artists worked outside of broader groups because their research posed a significant security threat to the established powers of the day. The few innovations that did emerge out of networks, the portable, spring-loaded watches that first appeared in Nuremberg in 1480, the double-entry bookkeeping system developed by Italian merchants, have their geographic origins in cities, where information networks were more robust. 1st quadrant solo entrepreneurs, crafting their products in secret to ensure their eventual payday, turn out to be practically non-existent. Gutenberg was the exception, not the rule. 16.0 to 18.0. Scanning the next 2 centuries, we see that the pattern changes dramatically. Solo, amateur innovation surrenders much of its lead to the rising power of networks in commerce. The most dramatic change lies along the horizontal axis, in a mass migration from individual breakthroughs to the creative insights of the group. Less than 10% of innovation during the Renaissance is networked. 2 centuries later, a majority of breakthrough ideas emerge in collaborative environments. Multiple developments precipitate this shift, starting with Gutenberg's press, which begins to have a material impact on secular research a century and a half after the first Bible hits the stand, as scientific ideas are stored and shared in the form of books and pamphlets. Postal systems, so central to Enlightenment science, flower across Europe. Population densities increase in the urban centers. Coffeehouses and formal institutions like the Royal Society create new hubs for intellectual collaboration. Many of those innovation hubs exist outside the marketplace. The great minds of the period, Newton, Franklin, Priestley, Hooke, Jefferson, Locke, Lavoisier, Linnaeus, had little hope of financial reward for their ideas and did everything in their power to encourage their circulation. A vertical movement toward market incentives is noticeable, nonetheless. As industrial capitalism arises in England in the 18th century, new economic structures raise the stakes for commercial ventures. Tantalizing rewards lure innovators into private enterprise, and the codification of English patent laws in the early 1700s gives some reassurance that good ideas will not be stolen with impunity. Despite this new protection, Most commercial innovation during this period takes a collaborative form, with many individuals and firms contributing crucial tweaks and refinements to the product. The history books like to condense these slower, evolutionary processes into eureka moments dominated by a single inventor. But most of the key technologies that powered the Industrial Revolution were instances of what scholars call collective invention. Textbooks casually refer to James Watt as the inventor of the steam engine. But in truth, Watt was one of dozens of innovators who refined the device over the course of the 18th century. 1800 present. Let us pause for a moment on the cusp of the modern age and take a few bets as to what pattern will form in the final 2 centuries of the millennium. I think most of us would expect to see a dramatic consolidation of innovative activity in the first quadrant, as capitalism enters its mature period, spanning the ages of mass production and the consumer society. All the elements would seem to predict an explosion of first quadrant activity, an increasingly wealthy public willing to spend money on new gadgets, strong enforcement of intellectual property rights, the emergence of corporate research and development labs, and a growing pool of private capital willing to finance speculative ventures. If the competitive marketplace of modern capitalism is the great innovation engine of our time, the first quadrant should by rights dominate the last 2 centuries of activity. But instead, another pattern appears. Against all odds, the first quadrant turns out to be the least populated on the grid. Willis Carrier is an outlier after all. In the private sector, the proprietary breakthrough achieved in a closed lab turns out to be a rarity. For every Alfred Nobel inventing dynamite in secret in the suburbs of Stockholm, there are a half-dozen collective inventions like the vacuum tube or the television, whose existence depended upon multiple firms driven by the profit motive who managed to create a significant new product via decentralized networking. Folklore calls Edison the inventor of the light bulb, but in truth the light bulb came into being through a complex network of interaction between Edison and his rivals, each contributing key pieces to the puzzle along the way. Collective invention is not some socialist fantasy. Entrepreneurs like Edison and DeForest were very much motivated by the possibility of financial rewards, and they tried to patent as much as they could. But the utility of building on other people's ideas often outweighed the exclusivity of building something entirely from scratch. You could develop small ideas in a locked room, cut off from the hunches and insights of your competition. But if you wanted to make a major new incursion into the adjacent possible, you needed company. Even more striking, though, is the explosion of fourth quadrant activity. Why have so many good ideas flourished in the fourth quadrant, despite the lack of economic incentives? One answer is that economic incentives have a much more complicated relationship to the development and adoption of good ideas than we usually imagine. The promise of an immense payday encourages people to come up with useful innovations, but at the same time it forces people to protect those innovations. Economists define efficient markets as markets where information is evenly distributed among all the buyers and sellers in the space. Efficiency is generally held to be a universal goal for any economy, unless the economy happens to traffic in ideas. If ideas were fully liberated, then entrepreneurs wouldn't be able to profit from their innovations because their competitors would immediately adopt them. And so where innovation is concerned, we have deliberately built inefficient markets, environments that protect copyrights and patents and trade secrets and 1,000 other barricades we've erected to keep promising ideas out of the minds of others. That deliberate inefficiency doesn't exist in the fourth quadrant. No, these non-market, decentralized environments do not have immense paydays to motivate their participants. But their openness creates other, powerful opportunities for good ideas to flourish. All of the patterns of innovation we have observed in the previous chapters, liquid networks, slow hunches, serendipity, noise, exaptation, emergent platforms, do best in open environments where ideas flow in unregulated channels. In more controlled environments, where the natural movement of ideas is tightly restrained, they suffocate. A slow hunch can't readily find its way to another hunch that might complete it if there's a tariff to be paid every time it tries to make a new serendipitous connection. Exaptations can't readily occur across disciplinary lines if there are sentries guarding those borders. In open environments, however, those patterns of innovation can easily take hold and multiply. Like any complex social reality, creating innovation environments is a matter of trade-offs. All other things being equal, financial incentives will indeed spur innovation. The problem is, all other things are never equal. When you introduce financial rewards into a system, barricades and secrecy emerge, making it harder for the open patterns of innovation to work their magic. So the question is, what is the right balance? It's certainly conceivable that the promise of hitting a financial jackpot is so overwhelming that it more than makes up for the inefficiencies introduced by intellectual property law. and closed R&D labs. That has generally been the guiding assumption for most modern discussions of innovation's roots, an assumption largely based on the free market's track record for innovation during that period. Because capitalist economies proved to be more innovative than socialist and communist economies, the story went, the deliberate inefficiencies of the market-based approach must have benefits that exceed their costs. But, as we have seen, this is a false comparison. The test is not how the market fares against command economies. The real test is how it fares against the fourth quadrant. As the private corporation evolved over the past 2 centuries, a mirror image of it grew in parallel in the public sector, the modern research university. Most academic research today is fourth quadrant in its approach. New ideas are published with the deliberate goal of allowing other participants to refine and build upon them, with no restrictions on their circulation beyond proper acknowledgement of their origin. It is not pure anarchy, to be sure. You can't simply steal a colleague's idea without proper citation. But there is a fundamental difference between suing for patent infringement and asking for a footnote. Academics are paid salaries, of course, and successful ideas can lead to much sought-after tenured professorships, but the economic rewards are minuscule compared to those of the private sector. And, crucially, those rewards are not dependent on introducing an artificial inefficiency into the information network. A historian who develops a brilliant new theory about the origins of the Industrial Revolution may well land a chaired professorship at an Ivy League school thanks to her theory. But the theory itself can freely circulate through the environment, where it can be challenged, enlarged, exapted, and recycled in countless ways. The university system may be big business these days, and patents do play a role in some specialized fields, but for the most part the university remains an information commons. Universities have a reputation for ivory tower isolation from the real world, but it is an undeniable fact that most of the paradigmatic ideas in science and technology that arose during the past century have roots in academic research. This is obviously true for the pure sciences like theoretical physics, but it is also true for lines of research that on their surface seem to have more straightforwardly commercial applications. The oral contraceptive, for instance, has generated billions of dollars for big pharma over the past half-century. But most of the critical research that led to its development happened in the intellectual commons of university labs at Harvard, Princeton, and Stanford. In the language of the last chapter, open networks of academic researchers often create emergent platforms where commercial development becomes possible. The next decade will likely see a wave of pharmaceutical products enabled by genomic science, but that underlying scientific platform, most critically, the ability to sequence and map DNA, was almost entirely developed by a decentralized group of academic scientists working outside the private sector in the 1960s and 70s. This is a pattern we see again and again in the modern era. Fourth quadrant innovation creates a new open platform that commercial entities can then build upon, either by repackaging and refining the original breakthrough, or by developing emergent innovations on top of the underlying platform. Fourth quadrant innovation has been assisted by another crucial development: the increased flow of information. Information spillover required the geographic density of cities in the Renaissance, while the postal system made small distributed webs of creativity possible in the Enlightenment. But the internet has effectively reduced the transmission costs of sharing good ideas to zero. In Galileo's time, all the benefits of information spillover were as potent as they are today. But it was far more difficult to create the kind of liquid network where those serendipitous collisions and exaptations could take place. The connectedness of modern life means that we face the opposite problem. It is much harder to stop information from spilling over than it is to get it into circulation. The consequence of this is that private sector firms who are intent on protecting their intellectual assets have to invest time and money in building barricades of artificial scarcity. Participants in the fourth quadrant don't have those costs. They can concentrate on coming up with new ideas, not building fortresses around the old ones. And because those ideas can freely circulate through the infosphere, they can be refined and expanded by other minds in the network. We do not have a ready-made political vocabulary for the fourth quadrant, particularly the non-institutional forms of collaboration that have developed around the open-source community. Because these open systems operate outside the conventional incentives of capitalism and resist the usual strictures of intellectual property, the mind reflexively wants to put them on the side of socialism. And yet they are as far from the state-centralized economies that Marx and Engels helped invent as they are from greed as good capitalism. They themselves are not the product of market incentives, but they often create environments where private firms thrive, a phenomenon Lawrence Lessig alludes to in his concept of the hybrid economy, which blends elements from the open networks of the intellectual commons with the more proprietary walls and tariffs of the private sphere. None of this is meant to imply that the marketplace is the enemy of innovation, or that competition between rival firms doesn't often lead to useful new products. And top-heavy bureaucracies remain innovation sinkholes. But, fortunately for us, the choice is not between decentralized markets and command and control states. Much of the history of intellectual achievement over these past centuries has lived in a less formal space between those two regimes, in the grad seminar and the coffeehouse and the hobbyist's home lab and the digital bulletin board. The fourth quadrant should be a reminder that more than one formula exists for innovation. The wonders of modern life did not emerge exclusively from the proprietary clash between private firms. They also emerged from open networks. A few months after Darwin published On the Origin of Species in 1859, Karl Marx wrote Friedrich Engels a letter that included a few lines endorsing Darwin's biological radicalism. Although it is developed in the crude English style, this is the book which contains the basis in natural history for our view. The crude English style was evidently Darwin's strange unwillingness to incessantly relate his scientific views back to Hegelian dialectics. Beyond the sneers, Marx and Engels were clearly energized by the controversy Darwin had unleashed and saw him as a kindred spirit in an age that seemed on the verge of multiple revolutions, in science as well as in society. It is unclear whether Darwin felt quite the same way about his Prussian admirers. Marx offered to dedicate Volume 2 of Das Kapital to Darwin, who demurred, "I should prefer the part or volume not to be dedicated to me, as that would, in a certain extent, suggest my approval of the whole work, with which I am not acquainted." From a scientific point of view, Marx and Engels were smart to side with Darwin so early in the debate over his dangerous idea. But they couldn't have been more wrong in their predictions about the way the theory would play out in the politico-economic arena. They anticipated, correctly, that analogies would be drawn between Darwin's survival of the fittest and the competitive selection of capitalist free market economies. Marx and Engels just assumed those analogies would be launched as critiques of capitalism. In 1865, Engels wrote to a friend, "Nothing discredits modern bourgeois development so much as the fact that it has not yet succeeded in getting beyond the economic forms of the animal world." As it turned out, the exact opposite happened. Darwin's theories were invoked countless times in the 20th century as a defense of the free market system. Aligning them with the animal world didn't discredit markets, as Engels had predicted. It made markets look natural. If Mother Nature made such a splendidly diverse planet through an algorithm of ruthless competition between selfish agents, why shouldn't our economic systems follow the same rules? Yet the true story of nature is not one of exclusively ruthless competition between selfish agents, as Darwin himself realized. Origin of Species ends with one of the most famous passages in the history of science, one that echoes the journal entry he wrote on leaving the Keeling Islands more than 20 years before. It is interesting to contemplate a tangled bank, clothed with many plants of many kinds, with birds singing on the bushes, with various insects flitting about, and with worms crawling through the damp earth, and to reflect that these elaborately constructed forms, so different from each other and dependent upon each other in so complex a manner, have all been produced by laws acting around us. Thus, from the war of nature, from famine and death, the most exalted object which we are capable of conceiving, namely, the production of the higher animals, directly follows. There is grandeur in this view of life. Darwin's words here oscillate between two structuring metaphors that govern all his work: the complex interdependencies of the tangled bank, and the war of nature, the symbiotic connections of an ecosystem and the survival of the fittest. The popular caricature of Darwin's theory emphasizes competitive struggle above everything else. Yet so many of the insights his theory made possible have revealed the collaborative and connective forces at work in the natural world. We have been living with a comparable caricature in our assumptions about cultural innovation. Look at the past 5 centuries from the long view, and one fact confronts the eye immediately: market-based competition has no monopoly on innovation. Competition and the profit motive do indeed motivate us to turn good ideas into shipping products, but more often than not, the ideas themselves come from somewhere else. Whatever its politics, the fourth quadrant has been an extraordinary space of human creativity and insight. Even without the economic rewards of artificial scarcity, fourth quadrant environments have played an immensely important role in the nurturing and circulation of good ideas, now more than ever. In Darwin's language, the open connections of the tangled bank have been just as generative as the war of nature. Stephen Jay Gould makes this point powerfully in the allegory of his sandal collection. The wedge of competition has been, ever since Darwin, the canonical argument for progress in normal times, he writes. But I will claim that the wheel of quirky and unpredictable functional shift is the major source of what we call progress at all scales. The Nairobi entrepreneur selling sandals in an open-air market may indeed be in competition with other cobblers, but what makes his trade possible is the junkyard full of tires waiting to be freely converted into footwear, and the fact that the good idea of converting tires into sandals can be passed from cobbler to cobbler by simple observation, with no licensing agreements to restrict the flow. In 1813, a Boston mill owner, Isaac McPherson, found himself immersed in a long and frustrating patent dispute with a Philadelphia-based inventor named Oliver Evans, who had patented an automated grist mill several years before. Evans's engineering talent was matched only by his litigiousness. He was notorious for aggressively enforcing his patents, and was among the first to exploit the new restrictive powers of the federal patent system after its creation in 1790. The originality of Evans's patented invention was highly debatable. The grist mill system relied on bucket elevators, conveyor belts, and Archimedean screws, all of which were clearly innovations that had long been in the public domain. When Evans sued McPherson for violating his patents, the Boston industrialist decided to reach out to the first patent commissioner of the United States, a former politician and inventor himself, now living in rural Virginia. And so, in the summer of 1813, McPherson wrote a letter to Thomas Jefferson, asking for his interpretation of Oliver Evans's claim. Jefferson wrote back on August 13. Reading his letter now, one cannot help but be amazed by the range of Jefferson's intelligence. His focus narrows into intense technical detail on the specifics of Evans's invention, and then widens to their ancient prehistory. The screw of Archimedes is as ancient, at least, as the age of that mathematician who died more than 2,000 years ago. Diodorus Siculus speaks of it, L.I. p. 21 and L.V. p. 217 of Stephen's edition of 1559, folio, and Vitruvius 12. He reviews the relevant law with the sharp eye of a legal scholar, opining on the sections that he thinks are fundamentally flawed. But the most stirring passages arise when Jefferson waxes philosophical on the nature of ideas themselves. Stable ownership is the gift of social law, and is given late in the progress of society. It would be curious then, if an idea, the fugitive fermentation of an individual brain, could, of natural right, be claimed an exclusive and stable property. If nature has made any one thing less susceptible than all others of exclusive property, it is the action of the thinking power called an idea, which an individual may exclusively possess as long as he keeps it to himself. But the moment it is divulged, it forces itself into the possession of every one, and the receiver cannot dispossess himself of it. Its peculiar character, too, is that no one possesses the less, because every other possesses the whole of it. He who receives an idea from me receives instruction himself without lessening mine, as he who lights his taper at mine receives light without darkening me. That ideas should freely spread from one to another over the globe, for the moral and mutual instruction of man, and improvement of his condition, seems to have been peculiarly and benevolently designed by nature, when she made them, like fire, expansible over all space, without lessening their density in any point, and like the air in which we breathe, move, and have our physical being, incapable of confinement or exclusive appropriation. Inventions then cannot, in nature, be a subject of property. Ideas, Jefferson argues, have an almost gravitational attraction toward the fourth quadrant. The natural state of ideas is flow and spillover in connection. It is society that keeps them in chains. Does this mean we have to do away with intellectual property law? Of course not. The innovation track record of the fourth quadrant doesn't mean that patents should be abolished and all forms of information allowed to run free. But it should definitely put the lie to the reigning orthodoxy that without the artificial scarcity of intellectual property, innovation would grind to a halt. There are plenty of understandable reasons why the law should make it easier for innovative people or organizations to profit from their creations. We may very well decide as a society that people simply deserve to profit from their good ideas, and so we have to introduce a little artificial scarcity to ensure those rewards. As someone who creates intellectual property for a living, I am more than sympathetic toward that argument. But it is another matter altogether to argue that those restrictions will themselves promote innovation in the long run. As Lawrence Lessig has so persuasively argued over the years, there is nothing natural about the artificial scarcity of intellectual property law. Those laws are deliberate interventions crafted by human intelligence and are enforced almost entirely by non-market powers. Jefferson's point, in his letter to McPherson, is that if you really want to get into a debate about which system is more natural, then the free flow of ideas is always going to trump the artificial scarcity of patents. Ideas are intrinsically copyable in the way that food and fuel are not. You have to build dams to keep ideas from flowing. To my mind, the great question for our time is whether large organizations, public and private, governments and corporations alike, can better harness the innovation turbine of fourth quadrant systems. On the private sector side, the success of companies like Google and Twitter and Amazon, all of whom have, in different ways, contributed to and benefited from fourth quadrant innovation, has made it clear that, in the software world, at least, a little openness goes a long way. I suspect those lessons will grow increasingly inescapable in the decades to come. But it is the public sector that I find more interesting, because governments and other non-market institutions have long suffered from the innovation malaise of top-heavy bureaucracies. Today, these institutions have an opportunity to fundamentally alter the way they cultivate and promote good ideas. The more the government thinks of itself as an open platform instead of a centralized bureaucracy, the better it will be for all of us, citizens and activists, and entrepreneurs alike. The wonderful irony is that this historic opportunity comes to governments in part because of an innovation that they unleashed on the world, the Internet, probably the clearest example of the way that public and private sector innovation can complement each other. The generative platform of the Internet has created a space where countless fortunes have been made over the past 30 years, but the platform itself was created by the loose affiliation of information scientists around the world, funded, in large part, by the federal government of the United States. There are good ideas, and then there are good ideas that make it easier to have other good ideas. YouTube was a good idea that was made possible by the even better ideas of the Internet and the web. The fact that those idea-generating platforms were developed outside the private sector is no accident. Proprietary platforms that reach critical mass are not unheard of. Microsoft Windows has had a good run, for instance, and Apple's iPhone platform has been extraordinarily innovative in its first 3 years, but they are rarities. Generative platforms require all the patterns of innovation we have seen over the preceding pages. They need to create a space where hunches and serendipitous collisions and exaptations and recycling can thrive. It is possible to create such a space in a walled garden. But you are far better off situating your platform in a commons. But perhaps commons is the wrong word for the environment we're trying to imagine, though it has a long and sanctified history in intellectual property law. The problem with the term is twofold. For starters, it has conventionally been used in opposition to the competitive struggle of the marketplace. The original commons of rural England disappeared when they were swallowed up by the private enclosures of agrarian capitalism in the 17th and 18th centuries. Yet the innovation environments we have explored are not necessarily hostile to competition and profit. More important, however, the commons metaphor doesn't suggest the patterns of recycling and exaptation and recombination that define so many innovation spaces. When you think of a commons, you think of a cleared field dominated by a single resource for grazing. You don't think of an ecosystem. The commons is a monocrop grassland, not a tangled bank. I prefer another metaphor drawn from nature, the reef. You need only survey a coral reef for a few minutes to see that competition for resources abounds in this space, as Darwin rightly observed. But that is not the source of its marvelous biodiversity. The struggle for existence is universal in nature. The few residents of a desert ecosystem are every bit as competitive as their equivalents on a coral reef. What makes the reef so inventive is not the struggle between the organisms but the way they have learned to collaborate, the coral and the zooxanthellae and the parrotfish borrowing and reinventing each other's work. This is the ultimate explanation of Darwin's paradox. The reef has unlocked so many doors of the adjacent possible because of the way it shares. The reef helps us understand the other riddles we began with, the runaway innovation of cities and of the web. They, too, are environments that compulsively connect and remix that most valuable of resources, information. Like the web, the city is a platform that often makes private commerce possible but which is itself outside the marketplace. You do business in the big city, but the city itself belongs to everyone. Ideas collide, emerge, recombine. New enterprises find homes in the shells abandoned by earlier hosts. Informal hubs allow different disciplines to borrow from one another. These are the spaces that have long supported innovation, from those first Mesopotamian settlements 8,000 years ago to the invisible layers of software that support today's web. Ideas rise in crowds, as Poincaré said. They rise in liquid networks where connection is valued more than protection. So if we want to build environments that generate good ideas, whether those environments are in schools or corporations or governments or our own personal lives, we need to keep that history in mind and not fall back on the easy assumptions that competitive markets are the only reliable source of good ideas. Yes, the market has been a great engine of innovation. But so has the reef. Most of us, I realize, don't have a direct say in what macro forms of information and economic organization prevail in the wider society, though we do influence the outcome indirectly in the basic act of choosing between employment in the private or the public sector. But this is the beauty of the long zoom perspective. The patterns recur at other scales. You may not be able to turn your government into a coral reef, but you can create comparable environments on the scale of everyday life, in the workplaces you inhabit, in the way you consume media, in the way you augment your memory. The patterns are simple, but followed together, they make for a whole that is wiser than the sum of its parts. Go for a walk, cultivate hunches, write everything down, but keep your folders messy, embrace serendipity, make generative mistakes, take on multiple hobbies, frequent coffee houses and other liquid networks, follow the links, let others build on your ideas, borrow, recycle, reinvent. Build a tangled bank.